The world was no longer a cradle. It was an unforgiving stage where everything lived, moved, and died by forces that obeyed nothing but themselves. Life, if it could still be called that, did not thrive. It fought, clawed, and consumed in a ceaseless cycle. And in the midst of it, Elara stood, one of the last remnants of a species whose reign had come to an end. Her boots crunched the ground beneath her, the shattered remnants of what had once been a road. Roads, buildings, bridges, none of them mattered anymore. Nature had taken back what humanity had once claimed, and it did so with a vengeance. Vines twisted through the husks of skyscrapers, trees split open concrete as easily as bone. In every crack and shadow, something watched, waiting, hunting. There were no accidents anymore, no coincidences. Life here moved with purpose. Elara's breath was steady, her mind sharp, her senses attuned to every shift in the air, every twitch of movement. She was augmented to survive, her body enhanced with the remnants of technology that had once promised to save humanity. Ironically, that same technology had outlasted most of the people it was meant to protect. Her muscles, her reflexes, everything had been fine-tuned, crafted to give her an edge in a world where humans no longer held dominion. Yet, it was the mind that remained unchanged, fragile in its attempt to make sense of a world that no longer made sense. She paused, staring at the twisted remains of what might have been a monument, a reminder of human pride. It was hard to tell now, with time and nature having ravaged its features. Perhaps it had once stood tall, a beacon of something greater, a declaration that humans had conquered this world. But in the end, what had they conquered? A planet that learned to devour them. A rustle in the distance brought her back to the present. Her fingers tightened around the worn grip of her weapon, though she knew better than to rely on it. Out here, everything had teeth. The creatures that now roamed the earth were unlike anything humanity had known. They were efficient, ruthless, and far more evolved than the apex predators of old. Even the smallest life forms carried lethal precision. A single misstep could mean the difference between walking away and being consumed. It wasn't fear that made Elara pause, but an understanding. The predators of this world did not kill out of malice. They killed because they existed to do so. There was no cruelty in it, only purpose. The air hummed with tension, as if the earth itself were coiled, waiting. It was always like this. There was no peace, only moments between the chaos where one might catch their breath before the world demanded its due again. Her mind wandered as she scanned the horizon, the ruins of a city overtaken by growth. Trees stretched far above, their canopies merging with broken towers, the line between nature and human creation indistinguishable. She couldn't help but wonder what had brought them here. The question gnawed at her, though it had no answer. There were no voices left to speak of the downfall, no records to trace the exact moment when humans lost control. All that remained were the scars of their overreach and the wild, unchecked power of a world that had learned to adapt in ways they could never anticipate. The first signs of humanity's fall had been subtle. Small shifts in the ecosystem, species adapting in ways no one predicted. But the shift accelerated. Something about the way life evolved, something too precise, too rapid. The world was shaping itself into something new, something hostile. Human, for all their intelligence, could not keep up. They were outpaced, outmatched. Perhaps it was arrogance that had blinded them. They had assumed they could contain the world, mold it to their will. But nature had always been indifferent, and now it had the upper hand. Elara wiped the sweat from her brow, her eyes narrowing as she surveyed the landscape. There was beauty here, though it was the kind that came with danger. Every vine, every flower, every animal, it all had a purpose, and that purpose was survival at the cost of another. There was no place for weakness in this ecosystem. Everything was sharp, honed by the relentless pressure of existence. The ruins told stories, but they weren't the kind passed down in history books. These were silent, etched into the bones of the earth. A building collapsed upon itself, the remnants of what had once been a bustling street corner, now a nest for predators that moved like shadows. Vehicles, once symbols of progress, rusted and gutted, were home to the smaller, deadlier things that thrived in the cracks of this new order. It was as if the very concept of human civilization had become an afterthought in the grander scheme of things. She moved cautiously, her eyes scanning the environment, knowing that even the wind could carry threats. There was no sound that could be trusted. Silence was often a trap. The creatures here had adapted to mimic, to deceive. What sounded like a bird might be something far more dangerous. What appeared as stillness could be a predator waiting to strike. But Elara had learned, adapted. Her body might have been enhanced, but it was her instinct that had kept her alive. Instinct and a question that lingered in the back of her mind. Why? Why was she still here? There was no point in asking where everyone had gone. The answer was written in the ruins. They had fallen, just as everything eventually would. The real question was why she, out of all the billions that once called this planet home, had survived. Was it chance? Was it because of the technology that had altered her? Or was there something else, something deeper that she hadn't yet grasped? She crouched by a stream, the water deceptively clear. Even here, danger lurked. Microorganisms, invisible to the eye, could strip flesh from bone in minutes. Everything on Earth had been designed to kill, from the tiniest bacterium to the largest predator. Even the air seemed thicker, filled with spores that could paralyze or worse if inhaled for too long. Survival wasn't just about avoiding the obvious dangers. It was about understanding that every breath, every step, every heartbeat could be your last. Elara's reflection rippled in the water, her face unfamiliar even to her. The enhancements had changed her, but the years had done more. She was a ghost, wandering through the remnants of a world that no longer recognized her. And yet, she was still human. Wasn't she? The question gnawed at her, but there was no answer. Not here, not now. Standing, she adjusted the straps of her gear and continued forward. There was always forward. There was no going back, not anymore. The past was buried beneath layers of earth and decay, memories that meant nothing to the creatures that now roamed these lands. The future, if it existed at all, was uncertain. But forward was the only direction that made sense, the only path she had. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of something familiar and foreign all at once. It wasn't human, not anymore. But it wasn't entirely animal either. The hair on the back of her neck rose. She had been hunted before. She would be hunted again. There was no escaping that cycle. Life hunted, life was hunted. The only question was, where did she fit in? Elara gripped her weapon tighter, her mind clear. There would be no hesitation, no second guessing. In this world, doubt was a death sentence. As she moved deeper into the wild, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. Something that understood, perhaps better than she did, what it meant to survive. There was a lesson here, buried beneath the weight of time and ruin. The question wasn't whether she would find it. The question was whether she could survive long enough to understand it. Elara pressed deeper into the wild, her movements smooth and deliberate, as if each step carried the weight of decisions made long ago. The ruins around her shifted in the pale light, their shadows playing tricks on her eyes. The remnants of a time that no longer existed sprawled in jagged lines against a horizon that seemed both endless and claustrophobic. She had learned early on not to expect answers from her surroundings. This world was no longer human. It had no need for humanity's old symbols, its markers of progress. Yet, something had shifted. The wind carried a sense of expectation, as if the earth beneath her boots held memories long buried, waiting for the right moment to resurface. She slowed her pace, scanning the landscape with the instinct of someone who understood that survival wasn't just about fighting predators, it was about paying attention to the unseen forces that shaped life. Ahead of her, a structure barely discernible through the overgrowth caught her eye. Unlike the ruined buildings she had passed earlier, this one stood intact, its lines still crisp, though weathered. The geometry was wrong, too deliberate, too purposeful for a world reclaimed by nature. She approached cautiously, her senses heightened by the feeling that something here did not belong. As she neared the structure, the air grew heavier, and the sounds of the surrounding forest faded into an eerie quiet. Vines wrapped themselves around the entrance, but they seemed to hesitate, as though unwilling to fully reclaim what lay inside. Elara's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to stay calm. The ruins told stories, but this one felt different, like a whisper, just beneath the surface, waiting to be heard. She pushed through the vegetation, her eyes adjusting to the dim light within the structure. It was a tunnel, carved into the earth, its walls lined with remnants of technology she barely recognized. The air was thick with dust and something else, something that smelled like time itself had settled in these halls. Elara moved cautiously, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She had no way of knowing who had built this place or what its purpose had been, but the craftsmanship spoke of precision. Whatever this was, it had been designed to last, even as the world above it crumbled. Her eyes traced the worn edges of what might have once been a console or a control panel. The markings on it were unfamiliar, but there was something undeniably human in the design. Humanity had tried to tame this world, she realized. This place was a relic of that effort, a monument to their struggle against forces they couldn't control. The weight of that realization pressed down on her, and for a moment she felt a pang of something close to grief. Grief for the people who had built this place, for the lives lost in the battle against nature's relentless advance. But the feeling passed quickly. There was no room for sentiment in this world. Sentiment was a weakness, and weakness got you killed. Her fingers brushed against the cold surface of a panel, and to her surprise, it flickered to life. A dim glow emanated from the screen, casting shadows across her face. The message it displayed was fragmented, the language broken and corrupted by time, but she could make out enough. To all survivors, message, final hope, preserve. Her breath caught. The words, though incomplete, sent a chill down her spine. This wasn't just another ruin. This was a message left by humans, perhaps the last of them. A warning? A plea? The thought that someone, long ago, had believed enough in the future to leave this behind shook her in a way she hadn't expected. She leaned closer, trying to decipher the rest of the message, but the screen flickered again, and then it was gone, leaving only a faint hum in its place. Elara stepped back, her mind racing. What had they been trying to preserve? What final hope had they left buried in these forgotten halls? The discovery filled her with a strange mixture of dread and curiosity. This world had moved on, its evolution had been brutal and efficient. The creatures that roamed it now had no memory of the people who once ruled here. They didn't care for the remnants of cities or the ruins of civilization. They didn't care for legacies. But humans did. That was their curse, wasn't it? The need to leave something behind, to make sure they were remembered, even when the world no longer had a place for them. She could feel the weight of that legacy now, heavy on her shoulders. What had they hoped to accomplish, those last survivors? What had they seen in this world's future that made them leave behind messages like this one? Elara's hand tightened around her weapon as she turned to leave the tunnel, her mind filled with questions. For so long, she had survived without asking why. There had been no room for such thoughts in the struggle to stay alive. But now, standing in the ruins of a forgotten past, she couldn't help but wonder if there was more to her existence than survival. The forest greeted her with its familiar sounds as she stepped back into the light, but something had changed. The discovery of that message had shifted something inside her, something she wasn't ready to confront yet. She couldn't shake the feeling that the world had more secrets to reveal, if only she knew where to look. And for the first time in a long time, she felt the stirrings of a new purpose. The world she had known was gone, but perhaps there were still pieces of it worth finding. Perhaps there was still a way to understand what had happened, to make sense of the chaos that had consumed everything. And perhaps, just perhaps, there was still something left to preserve. Elara made her way through the dense foliage, her mind replaying the fragmented message over and over. To all survivors, final hope, preserve. The words echoed in her thoughts, and with them came the weight of a question she couldn't yet answer. Was it worth it? The sun had begun to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. Elara knew better than to be caught out here after dark, but the message weighed on her too heavily to turn back. She pressed forward, moving toward the heart of the ruins she had once avoided. Here, in the remnants of a forgotten city, she could feel the presence of the past pressing in on her from all sides. This was once a place of human achievement, now overrun with life that had no need for human ingenuity. Creatures darted between the crumbling buildings, their movements fluid, effortless. They didn't concern themselves with the ruins of civilization. They lived in the present, adapted perfectly to the world as it was now. But humans weren't like that. They couldn't just live in the present. They were always looking to the past or the future, trying to make sense of things, trying to control what couldn't be controlled. That was their downfall. And yet, despite everything, Elara couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something important here, something worth understanding. She climbed through the wreckage of a once great structure, the walls crumbling beneath her touch. The air was thick with a smell of decay and growth, a reminder of how quickly the world had moved on without humanity. But as she pushed deeper into the ruins, she felt the pull of something ancient, something hidden. Her foot struck something hard, and she looked down to see a metal hatch, half buried in the dirt. It was old, rusted, but still intact. Without hesitation, she crouched down and pulled it open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. Elara hesitated for only a moment before descending into the unknown. The air grew cooler as she moved deeper into the earth, and the smell of damp stone filled her lungs. The stairway seemed to go on forever, winding deeper and deeper until she lost track of how far she had gone. Finally, she reached the bottom, and the darkness gave way to a faint glow. The tunnel opened into a vast chamber, its walls lined with the same forgotten technology she had seen before. But this was different. This place felt alive, as if it had been waiting for her. In the center of the chamber stood a massive structure, its surface smooth and reflective. Elara approached cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it, the answer, or at least the beginning of one. Whatever humanity had left behind, it was here, buried deep within the earth, protected from the ravages of time. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the cool surface of the structure. It hummed to life at her touch, and a series of lights flickered across its surface. A voice, distorted by time, echoed through the chamber. "Welcome to the final repository, humanity's last hope." Elara stepped back, her mind racing. The repository. This was what the message had spoken of. This was what they had tried to preserve. But what was it? What had they hidden away, deep beneath the earth, in a world that no longer had a place for them? The voice continued, its words growing clearer as the ancient technology reawakened. "You are the last, the final guardian of humanity's legacy. What you choose to do with this knowledge will shape the future." Elara stood frozen, the weight of those words sinking in. The last guardian, the final hope. She had spent so long surviving, so long fighting against the world as it was, that she hadn't stopped to consider what came next. But now, standing in the midst of humanity's forgotten legacy, she realized that the choice was hers. The world had moved on without humanity, but its memory remained, buried deep within the earth, waiting for someone to find it. The question was, did that memory still matter? Did the past have any relevance in a world that had evolved beyond it? Or was it time to let go, to embrace the world as it was now, and leave the past behind? Elara didn't know the answer, but she knew one thing for certain: whatever choice she made, it would change everything. The air grew cooler as Elara pressed on, the shadows growing denser as the sun dipped behind the jagged mountains. In the hours since discovering the ancient repository, her mind hadn't stopped racing. Every step carried with it the weight of the message she had found: final hope, humanity's legacy. But what was she supposed to do with it? What legacy was left to preserve in a world that had moved on, reshaping itself into something unrecognizable? The terrain shifted beneath her feet, the soil growing softer, more alive. Thick roots snaked out from the underbrush, as if the earth itself was watching her, testing her resolve. The sound of distant movement broke the stillness, subtle, almost imperceptible, but Elara's senses were too sharp to ignore it. She wasn't alone. The thought didn't surprise her. Nothing did anymore. Not after what she had seen. The forest around her thickened, the towering trees looming closer, their bark warped and pulsing with strange growths. It wasn't the natural wilderness she had known in her childhood. This was something different. The evolution of the planet had taken on a life of its own, fusing nature and something alien. A flicker of movement ahead drew her attention. She froze, her hand instinctively tightening around the blade at her waist. The figure was cloaked, its movements cautious but deliberate. It wasn't like the animals or mutated creatures that roamed the wilderness. It was human, or at least it had been once. Elara stepped forward, careful not to make a sound. Her eyes scanned the surrounding area, searching for others. There was no telling if this was a solitary traveler or part of a larger group. In a world where survival was the only law, trust was a fragile thing. The figure stopped, turning slowly. They had sensed her. For a moment, neither moved, the tension between them growing thick, like the vines wrapping around the nearby trees. Elara could see the glint of metal, a weapon, half concealed in the stranger's hand. She shifted her stance, ready to react if needed, but something in the stranger's posture gave her pause. There was no immediate aggression, no challenge. "Who are you?" The voice was rough, raspy, as though it hadn't been used much in recent times. It was distinctly human, though it carried the weight of something more primal, as if the world had worn away the layers of civilization from this person, leaving only the raw core behind. Elara didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped forward, revealing herself fully from behind the twisted trunk of a tree. She kept her hand close to her weapon, but made no move to draw it. The stranger's eyes, barely visible beneath their hood, flicked down to her hand, then back up to her face. "Just a traveler," Elara finally said, her voice steady. She let the words hang in the air for a moment, watching the stranger's reaction. They didn't move, but the tension in their stance seemed to ease slightly. The figure lowered their hood, revealing a face that was both human and something more. The skin was pale, almost translucent, and faint lines of bioluminescence traced the edges of their jaw and cheekbones. The eyes were larger than normal, dark and reflective, like those of a nocturnal animal. It was a face that had once been human, but had been altered by years, perhaps generations, of adaptation to the new world. "I've heard of others like you," Elara said, her voice quiet but firm. "People who change." The stranger's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Elara wondered if she had made a mistake. But then the figure spoke again. "You speak as if you're different," the stranger said, their voice carrying a hint of amusement, though it was laced with something darker. "You hold on to the old ways, don't you? The ways of humans before the world changed." Elara felt a flare of irritation, but she forced it down. She had encountered others like this before, survivors who had embraced the new world, who believed that humanity had to evolve in order to survive. She wasn't like them. She still clung to the idea that something of the old world could be preserved, that there was something fundamentally human worth saving. "I haven't changed," Elara said, her voice firm. "Not like you." The stranger tilted their head, as if considering her words. "Not yet." Before Elara could respond, the sound of movement echoed from the trees behind her. More figures emerged from the shadows, their forms blending with the dense foliage until they stepped into the dim light. Like the first stranger, they had the appearance of humans who had been altered, their bodies and features reshaped by the harsh environment. Some had skin patterned with strange, iridescent scales, while others moved with an unnatural fluidity, their limbs elongated and sinewy. Elara's hand tightened around her blade, but the first stranger raised a hand, signaling the others to hold back. "We mean you no harm," they said, their voice calm. "You're one of us, whether you admit it or not." "I'm not," Elara said sharply, taking a step back. "I'm not one of you." The stranger's eyes softened, and for a moment, Elara thought she saw a flicker of something human. "You think you're holding on to your humanity," they said quietly. "But humanity isn't about the shape of your body. It's about survival, about adapting to whatever the world throws at you." Elara shook her head. "That's not what it means to be human." The stranger didn't argue. Instead, they turned and gestured for her to follow. "Come with us," they said. "There's something you need to see." Elara hesitated, but curiosity tugged at her. She glanced at the others, noting the way they moved, the quiet efficiency with which they navigated the forest. They weren't like the wild creatures that roamed the earth now, but they weren't like the humans she remembered either. They were something in between, something new. After a moment, Elara followed. They led her deeper into the forest, moving through the underbrush with a practiced ease that made Elara uneasy. The terrain grew rougher, the trees taller and more twisted, their bark covered in strange, glowing fungi. It was as if the forest itself had become alive with a new kind of energy, one that pulsed beneath the surface of everything, changing it in subtle but undeniable ways. Eventually, they reached a clearing, and Elara stopped in her tracks. Before her stood a large underground entrance, partially hidden by overgrowth and debris. It was similar to the one she had found earlier, but this one was far more intact. The air here felt different, charged, almost electric. She could feel it buzzing against her skin, and she had the distinct impression that something important lay beneath the surface. The stranger led her down a set of stone steps into the underground colony. As they descended, the air grew cooler, and the sound of voices began to echo through the tunnel. Elara tensed, her senses on high alert. She wasn't sure what she expected to find, but she knew that whatever awaited her at the bottom of these steps would change everything. The tunnel opened up into a vast underground chamber, filled with people, men, women, children. Some looked like the stranger who had led her here, their bodies altered by the strange evolution of the planet. Others appeared more human, though even they carried signs of the New World's influence: glowing tattoos, elongated limbs, bioluminescent eyes. The chamber was lit by a strange, pulsing light that emanated from the walls, casting everything in a soft, eerie glow. The people moved about their tasks with quiet efficiency, their movements fluid and graceful. There was an air of calm here, a sense of purpose that Elara hadn't seen in a long time. "Welcome to our home," the stranger said, their voice low and reverent. "This is what remains of humanity." Elara looked around, taking in the scene before her. It was hard to believe that these people, so different from the humans she had known, could still call themselves human. And yet, there was something undeniably human about the way they interacted with each other, the way they cared for their children, the way they built their community in the face of a world that had turned against them. "They're not human," Elara said quietly, her voice filled with doubt. "Not like they used to be." The stranger smiled, though there was no humor in it. "No, they're not. But does that make them any less human?" Elara didn't answer. She wasn't sure she could. Hours passed as she moved through the colony, observing the people and the way they lived. The more she saw, the more conflicted she became. These people had found a way to survive in a world that had become hostile to them. They had adapted, evolved, and yet they still held on to something of their old selves, their compassion, their sense of community, their hope for the future. But at what cost? Was this really what it meant to be human? As night fell, Elara found herself standing on the edge of the colony, staring out into the darkness. The stranger who had led her here stood beside her, silent and watchful. "You still don't understand," they said softly, "but you will." Elara didn't respond. She wasn't sure she wanted to. In the distance, she could hear the sound of movement, something large and heavy moving through the forest. The stranger didn't seem concerned, but Elara felt a chill run down her spine. "Is that what you want?" she asked quietly. "To become like them?" The stranger looked at her, their expression unreadable. "It's not about what we want," they said. "It's about what we need." Elara looked away, her mind racing with questions she didn't know how to answer. The world had changed, and so had humanity. But where did she fit in this new world? Was she willing to change, to adapt, to survive? Or would she cling to the past, to a version of humanity that no longer existed? As the sounds of the forest grew louder, Elara knew one thing for certain: whatever choice she made, it would change everything. The air was heavy with moisture as Elara and Kael trudged through the overgrown remnants of what had once been a road. Vines thicker than her arm wove through the cracked pavement, each step sinking into the wet, loamy soil beneath. The jungle around them was alive with sound, the constant rustling of leaves, distant animal calls, and the hum of insects. The deeper they ventured, the more the remains of the old world faded into obscurity, swallowed by nature in a way that was both beautiful and terrifying. "How far do you think it is?" Elara's voice cut through the suffocating silence between them. But she kept her eyes on the path ahead, never glancing at Kael. "Far enough that we should be cautious," he replied after a pause, his tone unhurried. Kael never seemed in a rush. It irritated her, how he could walk through a world engineered to kill them with the same indifference he had shown during the collapse. They'd been walking for hours, the weight of their journey pressing heavily on Elara's thoughts. Kael had grown more silent as they moved deeper into the jungle, but it was the silence between them that gnawed at her most. It wasn't that they had nothing to say, there was too much, an unspoken chasm between their perspectives that grew wider with each step. The ruins of an old city loomed ahead, barely recognizable beneath the tangled mass of foliage that had reclaimed it. Towering skyscrapers, now crumbling husks, were entwined with trees, their roots pushing through the skeletal remains of concrete and steel. Nature had reclaimed everything, and it had done so with an efficiency that left no trace of human dominion. "It's strange," Kael said, breaking the silence. "How life just moves on. No matter how much we try to control it, it takes everything back in the end." Elara glanced at him briefly. "That's what bothers you, isn't it? You think we shouldn't try to reclaim anything." Kael didn't answer right away. His gaze swept across the ruins, the way the trees had woven themselves into the bones of the city, as though nature had always meant for it to be this way. "Maybe we're not meant to." She bristled. "We can't just give up." Kael finally looked at her, his expression calm. "It's not about giving up. It's about recognizing that the world isn't what it was. This place," he gestured to the jungle swallowing the city, "this is Earth now. We're the ones who don't belong anymore." They stopped at the edge of what had once been a plaza, now a dense thicket of trees and underbrush. A rusted monument, barely visible beneath the green overgrowth, jutted from the ground like a forgotten relic of a past era. Elara couldn't even tell what it had once depicted. "You're willing to accept that this is all that's left of us?" she asked, her voice low but sharp. Kael's gaze was steady, unnervingly so. "No. I accept that this is what the Earth has become. That doesn't mean we're finished. But we can't keep fighting the planet itself. We need to find a way to coexist, even if it's not the way we imagined." Elara turned away from him, staring at the ruins. "We can't just give up our future because the world decided it doesn't need us anymore." Kael walked past her, his steps careful on the uneven ground. "Maybe the world never needed us to begin with." As they moved deeper into the city, the environment grew more hostile. The plants here were different, thornier, with leaves that glittered like blades in the faint light filtering through the canopy. Each step felt dangerous, as though the jungle was watching, waiting for them to make a mistake. Elara's eyes scanned their surroundings, tense with a knowledge that everything here, from the smallest insect to the towering trees, was designed for one purpose: survival at any cost. And in this world, humanity was no longer the apex predator. "This isn't just nature reclaiming the land," she muttered. "This is something else." Kael nodded, his gaze focused ahead. "The Earth has adapted, evolved. Everything here is designed to survive in the harshest conditions. We've seen it happen to animals, plants, entire ecosystems rebuilt themselves after the fall. But what about us?" Elara's pace quickened. "We're part of this world too, Kael. We've always adapted. We're survivors, just like everything else." Kael's expression darkened. "Are we? Or are we just clinging to the remnants of something that's already gone? You've seen what happens when we try to rebuild. Cities falling, colonies overrun, people dying. Maybe we're not meant to survive this time." Elara stopped abruptly, turning to face him. "You don't believe that?" His eyes met hers, and for the first time since they'd begun their journey, she saw something in him shift, doubt. "I don't know what to believe anymore." The jungle around them was silent, oppressive in its stillness. Elara's mind raced with memories of what humanity had been, its cities, its achievements, its dreams for the future. And now, those dreams lay buried beneath a landscape that had no use for them. "We have to believe there's a way forward," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "We can't just let everything we were disappear." Kael's gaze dropped to the ground, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe that's not our choice anymore." They reached the outskirts of the vault just before dusk. The entrance was hidden, barely visible beneath layers of thick vines and moss, a remnant of an era long forgotten. It had taken years to find this place, rumors, old records, scattered clues that had led them here. And yet, standing before it now, Elara felt no triumph. "Do you really think we'll find answers here?" she asked, her hand resting on the cold metal surface of the door. Kael shrugged. "It's the last place left that might have something, anything, that can tell us what we need to know." Elara hesitated. "And if it doesn't, what then?" Kael didn't answer. He didn't have to. They both knew the answer, and it hung in the air between them like a shadow. The door creaked as it opened, revealing a dark corridor leading into the heart of the vault. Inside, the air was cool, sterile, a stark contrast to the wild, untamed world outside. As they stepped inside, the weight of the past seemed to press down on them, heavy with the knowledge of what had been lost. The vault had been a refuge once, a place where humanity had stored its most valuable knowledge, its hopes for the future. But now, it was just another ruin, forgotten and abandoned. Kael led the way through the dimly lit corridors, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Elara followed, her thoughts a storm of conflicting emotions. She wanted to believe that this place held the answers they were searching for, that somewhere in these forgotten halls, they would find a way to save humanity. But deep down, a part of her feared that Kael was right, that there was nothing left to save. They reached the central chamber, a vast room filled with rows of data banks and consoles. Dust coated every surface, and the air smelled faintly of decay. It was clear that no one had been here in years, maybe even decades. Elara approached one of the consoles, her fingers brushing the surface. "There's so much here," she whispered. "All of it, just left behind." Kael stood beside her, his expression unreadable. "We always thought we'd have time." Elara activated the console, watching as the screen flickered to life. Lines of code scrolled across the display, and for a moment she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe there was something here, something that could help them. But as she scrolled through the data, her hope faded. Most of the information was corrupted, incomplete. Whatever had been stored here was lost, fragmented beyond repair. Kael sighed, his voice quiet. "It's just a graveyard." Elara's hands clenched into fists. "We can't just accept this." Kael didn't respond, but his silence spoke volumes. Hours passed as they searched the vault, but with every passing moment, it became clearer that they wouldn't find what they were looking for. The knowledge they had come to retrieve was gone, lost to time and neglect. As they sat in the central chamber, exhausted and defeated, Kael spoke softly, his voice filled with a quiet resignation. "Maybe this was always how it was going to end." Elara shook her head. "It doesn't have to be. We can still." "Still what?" Kael interrupted, his tone sharper than she'd ever heard it. "Still try to fight a world that doesn't want us anymore. Still pretend that we're the ones in control?" Elara stared at him, her heart pounding. "We have to try." Kael's gaze softened, and for a moment she saw the man he had once been, hopeful, determined, willing to do whatever it took to save humanity. But that man was gone now, replaced by someone who had seen too much, lost too much. "Maybe it's time to let go," he said quietly. Elara looked away, her chest tight with emotion. She wanted to argue, to fight back, but the words wouldn't come. Because deep down, she wasn't sure if he was wrong. The jungle outside the vault was still, the only sound the distant rustle of leaves in the wind. The world moved on, indifferent to their struggles, their hopes, their dreams. And as they sat in the ruins of what had once been their last hope, Elara couldn't shake the feeling that maybe Kael was right. Maybe it was time to stop fighting. But even as the thought crossed her mind, a part of her refused to let go. Because as long as there was something left to fight for, even if it was just a memory of what humanity had once been, she couldn't give up. Not yet. The dim glow of the overhead lights in the vault's entryway hummed softly, casting long shadows against the smooth, metallic walls. Elara's boots clanged against the steel floor, the echo bouncing through the narrow corridor ahead of them. The heavy door behind them sealed shut with a hiss, trapping the humid jungle air outside and plunging them into a silence that felt ancient, undisturbed for centuries. The vault was a relic of the old world, built during the last days of humanity's golden age. It had been a final attempt at safeguarding knowledge, technology, and the remnants of what had once been a flourishing civilization. Now, it stood as a silent tomb, a monument to a world that had lost itself to ambition. Kael remained behind her, his presence barely noticeable in the darkened corridor. He had said little since they entered, his earlier cynicism now tempered by the weight of their discovery. Elara could feel his eyes on her, waiting for something, perhaps for her to break the silence, perhaps for some revelation to emerge from the shadows ahead. But she felt nothing but unease. "Do you think this is it?" Her voice was quiet, barely louder than a whisper. Kael's response came after a pause. "I think this is the last of it." There was a finality in his words that gnawed at her. This place, this vault, it wasn't just another abandoned relic, another ruin swallowed by time. It was the final repository of everything humanity had once been. It held within its walls the culmination of their achievements, their hopes, their mistakes. Elara ran her fingers along the cold metal wall, tracing the smooth lines of the ancient infrastructure. It felt alive, as though the vault itself was waiting, expectant. She couldn't help but wonder what had been left behind in this forgotten stronghold, what answers, if any, it might hold. The corridor opened into a vast chamber, its ceiling towering above them. Massive columns of steel and glass lined the walls, each one housing data banks, technological relics, and artifacts from a time long gone. The air was cool and dry, a stark contrast to the oppressive humidity outside. It felt sterile, untouched. "This place is incredible," Kael said, his voice breaking the stillness as he stepped into the room beside her. "It's like walking through the last memories of a dead civilization." Elara's gaze swept across the chamber, taking in the sheer scale of the technology and knowledge that had been stored here. This was it, the heart of what humanity had tried so desperately to preserve. And yet, despite the wealth of information and tools that surrounded them, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing in a graveyard. "It's more than memories," she said softly. "This is what they left behind, the sum of everything they thought mattered." They moved further into the chamber, their footsteps muted by the thick silence. Elara stopped in front of a terminal, the screen dark and covered in dust. She wiped it clean with the edge of her sleeve, revealing a series of intricate symbols and text. It was an interface unlike anything she had seen before, a language lost to the world outside. "What do you think it says?" Kael asked, peering over her shoulder. Elara hesitated before answering. "I'm not sure, but if this place is what we think it is, then whatever's on here might be important." Kael nodded. Important or dangerous? She tapped a few keys, watching as the terminal flickered to life. The symbols on the screen shifted, lines of data scrolling past faster than she could comprehend. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, answers, maybe, or some kind of explanation for why things had gone so wrong. But what she found was far more unsettling. The data banks held more than just records of technological advancements. There were reports, hundreds of them, detailing the slow collapse of the ecosystem, the shifts in climate, the rise of unpredictable natural disasters. Humanity had known it was losing control, even as it continued to push forward with its experiments, its colonization, its unrelenting desire to dominate the natural world. "They knew," she muttered, her eyes scanning the screen. "They knew what was happening, and they kept going anyway." Kael's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" She gestured to the terminal. "It's all here. The environmental breakdowns, the overpopulation, the weapons they built to try and keep the Earth in check. They saw the warning signs, but they ignored them. They kept pushing, thinking they could fix it with technology, with power. Kael was silent for a moment, his gaze distant. And that's what did them in. Elara nodded slowly. They thought they could control everything, even nature itself, but they were wrong. The planet adapted, evolved faster than they could keep up. And now, this is all that's left. Kael's jaw tightened. So, in the end, it wasn't the Earth that destroyed us. We did it to ourselves. The weight of his words settled over them like a shroud, the air in the vault growing heavier with the implications of their discovery. Elara wanted to deny it, to argue that there had been something else, some external force, some uncontrollable event that had led to humanity's downfall. But the evidence was right in front of her, laid bare in the cold, unfeeling data. All this knowledge, all this technology, Kael continued, his voice low. It didn't save them. It only made things worse. Elara turned away from the terminal, her stomach twisting with a mix of anger and sorrow. She had always believed that humanity had been victims of circumstance, that they had been undone by forces beyond their control. But now, faced with the truth, she could see the hubris that had led to their extinction. They had been so focused on conquering the world that they had forgotten how to live in it. "This is what you wanted, isn't it?" she asked quietly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the machinery. "Proof that we don't deserve to survive." Kael's gaze hardened, but he didn't respond right away. He moved to another terminal, activating it with a few swift motions. The screen illuminated, revealing more data, schematics for weapons, blueprints for cities that had never been built, maps of colonies on distant planets. "I didn't want this," he said at last. "But I always knew we weren't innocent. We were never innocent." Elara clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. "So what now? Do we just give up? Walk away and let it all die with us?" Kael looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Maybe it's not about giving up. Maybe it's about accepting that we were wrong, that we can't keep trying to control everything. But we can't just let go," she protested. "We can't just abandon everything we've built, everything we've fought for." Kael's gaze softened. "What have we really built, Elara? What have we fought for? A dying world? A system that was doomed from the start?" She shook her head, refusing to accept it. "There has to be a way to fix this, to make things right." Kael sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Maybe there is, but it won't be found in this vault. Not in these machines, not in this technology. Maybe the answer is something we've been ignoring all along." Elara stared at him, her mind racing. "You're talking about coexistence." He nodded. "We've spent so long trying to dominate the Earth, to bend it to our will. But what if we were never meant to? What if the only way forward is to learn how to live with it, instead of against it?" Elara was silent, the weight of his words pressing down on her. It was a simple idea, and yet it felt impossibly distant. Humanity had spent millennia building civilizations, shaping the world to fit their needs. The thought of abandoning that pursuit, of letting go of the desire for control, felt like giving up on everything they had ever known. But deep down, she knew Kael was right. "Knowledge without wisdom," she muttered, the phrase tumbling from her lips before she even realized she had spoken it. Kael raised an eyebrow. "What?" "That's what this is," she said, gesturing to the vault around them. "All this knowledge, all this power, we had it, but we didn't know how to use it. We didn't understand what we were doing." Kael's gaze grew thoughtful. "And that's what led to our downfall." Elara nodded, her mind churning with the implications. "We pursued power, but we never stopped to think about the consequences. We thought we could fix everything with technology, but we were blind to the bigger picture." Kael folded his arms, his eyes narrowing as he considered her words. "So what does that mean for us, for what we're trying to do now?" Elara met his gaze, her voice steady. "It means we need to stop looking for answers in the past. We can't keep trying to rebuild what we've lost. We need to find a new way, a way that doesn't rely on control or domination." Kael was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he nodded. Maybe you're right. The two of them stood in silence, the weight of their discovery settling over them like a heavy fog. The vault had offered them answers, but not the ones they had been hoping for. Instead, it had revealed the truth they had both been avoiding, that humanity's downfall had been of their own making. And now, they were left to decide what to do with that knowledge. As they turned to leave the chamber, Elara couldn't help but feel a sense of dread creeping into her chest. The world outside was still as hostile, still as dangerous as ever. But perhaps, armed with this understanding, they could find a way to survive, not by dominating the earth, but by learning to live with it. But even as the thought crossed her mind, she knew it would not be easy. Humanity had spent so long fighting against the natural world that the idea of coexistence felt foreign, even impossible. Yet, as the door to the vault slid shut behind them, sealing away the past once more, Elara couldn't shake the feeling that it was the only way forward. And that maybe, just maybe, they still had a chance to make things right. The cold air of the wasteland felt sharper than usual as Kael and Elara emerged from the vault, the weight of their discovery pressing down like a phantom force. The once brilliant sun hung low behind a veil of dark clouds, casting a sickly glow over the barren landscape. The contrast between what they had just uncovered and the harsh reality outside was almost overwhelming. Yet, there was no time to linger on the unease that clung to them both. Earth's creatures, those relentless manifestations of evolution, were growing bolder, their presence a reminder that time would not wait for them to decide their next move. Kael's hand instinctively reached for the weapon slung over his shoulder, its cold metal comforting in its simplicity. Elara remained still, her eyes scanning the horizon, deep in thought. The creatures had changed once again since their last encounter, new forms, new adaptations. It was as if the earth itself had taken offense to their presence, retaliating with each new day. What had started as animals and plants reshaping themselves into more dangerous versions had now spiraled into something far more intricate. "Kael, look," Elara finally spoke, her voice soft but urgent. She pointed toward a patch of strange flora growing near the base of a withered tree. What had once been ordinary plants now shimmered with an unsettling metallic hue, the leaves twisting and coiling as if aware of their gaze. "They've merged," Kael muttered, stepping closer to examine the strange sight. The plant life had integrated pieces of metal and stone into their forms, a bizarre fusion of organic and inorganic matter. Tendrils of vines slithered across the ground like serpents, glistening with an odd sheen that suggested something far beyond mere biology. Nature and machine. Elara knelt beside him, her fingers brushing against one of the vines. "Symbiosis," she whispered, more to herself than to Kael. "This isn't just evolution anymore. It's something else, nature adapting to the remnants of what we left behind." Kael's eyes narrowed. "It's not just adapting. It's taking what we created and using it against us. Nature isn't healing, it's becoming something new. Something we can't predict." His voice was low, edged with tension, and Elara could feel the weight of his words as they settled between them. As they stood in silence, the rustling of leaves brought their attention back to the landscape. In the distance, figures moved, creatures they could only vaguely make out, but they were different now. Faster, sleeker. It was as though the earth had taken their designs, merging organic elements with technology in ways neither could have imagined. It wasn't just survival anymore, it was evolution with a purpose, one far more intelligent than either of them had realized. The attack came swiftly, without warning. A creature, a grotesque hybrid of flesh and metal, lunged from the shadows, its body rippling with unnatural movement. Kael was the first to react, his weapon firing a volley of energy bolts. The shots hit their target, but it was already too late. The beast had anticipated the attack, its metallic skin deflecting the projectiles as it reared back and struck. Elara screamed, narrowly avoiding the creature's claws as they raked through the air where she had stood just moments before. Her heart pounded in her chest as she fumbled for her weapon, but the beast was relentless, circling them with terrifying speed. Every time they aimed, it was gone, its fluid movements blending seamlessly with the environment. "This isn't normal," Elara shouted over the chaos, panic creeping into her voice. "They're learning." Kael's grip tightened on his weapon as he backed up toward her, eyes locked on the creature. "It's more than that. They're evolving faster than we can react. We need to move, now." The battle was fierce but brief. With a well-aimed shot to a vulnerable spot near the creature's head, Kael managed to bring it down. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by their labored breaths. The sight of the fallen creature before them, a perfect fusion of organic and mechanical, stirred something deep in both of them. This was no longer just a battle for survival. It was a war against something they didn't understand, something far more advanced than they had anticipated. As they pressed forward, navigating through the dense terrain, Kael couldn't shake the feeling that everything was spiraling out of control. The creatures weren't just evolving, they were becoming smarter, more efficient. Each encounter was more dangerous than the last, and the changes in the landscape hinted that this was only the beginning. Elara, walking a few steps behind, was lost in thought. She had always believed that humanity could reclaim what was lost, that they could find a way to survive on this unforgiving planet. But now, after what they had discovered in the vault, she wasn't so sure. Could they really continue to fight against a world that had already moved on without them? The vault's knowledge hung heavy in her mind. The history of human hubris, the reliance on technology to control and dominate. And yet, here they were, facing the consequences of that very arrogance. The creatures of Earth weren't just fighting back, they were surpassing them in every way. Nature, once something to be tamed, had become the superior force. Her thoughts were interrupted by Kael's voice. "We need to make a decision, Elara." She looked up, her eyes meeting his. They had stopped near the ruins of an old building, its skeletal remains barely standing against the ravages of time. Kael gestured to the small device in his hand, the one they had retrieved from the vault. It pulsed faintly, a remnant of the old world's technology, holding within it the potential to change everything. "Do we use it?" he asked, his tone heavy with the weight of the question. Elara stared at the device, her mind racing. It held power that could give them an edge, power that could push back against the rapid evolution of Earth's creatures. But at what cost? The vault had shown them the consequences of relying too much on technology, the ways in which it had led humanity to its downfall. Could they really risk repeating those mistakes? Kael seemed to sense her hesitation. "If we don't use it, we're dead," he said bluntly. "These creatures, this world, it's evolving faster than we can keep up. We need something to level the playing field." "But isn't that what got us into this mess in the first place?" Elara shot back, her voice rising with frustration. "We tried to control the world with technology, and look where it led. Maybe the answer isn't to fight against it anymore." Kael's brow furrowed, his jaw clenched. "So what? You think we should just accept our fate? Let the earth consume us?" There was a bitterness in his words, a frustration born out of years of struggle and loss. "We didn't survive all this just to give up now." Elara shook her head, her thoughts tangled in conflicting emotions. "I don't know, Kael. I really don't. But I do know that if we keep doing what we've always done, we're going to end up exactly where we started. Maybe the answer isn't in fighting anymore. Maybe it's in finding a way to coexist with this world, instead of trying to dominate it." Her words hung in the air, and for a long moment, Kael didn't respond. He paced in front of the ruins, the tension in his movements palpable. "And how exactly do we coexist with creatures that want to tear us apart?" he finally asked, his voice tight with suppressed anger. "Because right now, that doesn't seem like an option." Elara sighed, rubbing her temples. "I'm not saying it's going to be easy. I don't even know if it's possible. But maybe we need to stop seeing this world as an enemy. Maybe we need to start thinking about what it's trying to tell us." Kael stopped pacing and turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" She took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "Everything we've seen, the creatures, the plants, the way the earth is changing, it's all part of a larger pattern. It's like the planet is trying to find balance again, after everything we did to it. And maybe we need to find a way to be part of that balance." Kael crossed his arms, his gaze unwavering. "You really think that's possible, after everything we've done?" Elara met his eyes, her voice quiet but firm. "I think we have to try. If we don't, we're just going to end up repeating the same mistakes over and over again." Kael was silent for a long time, his expression hard to read. He was torn, she could see that. Torn between his instincts to fight and survive, and the truth of what Elara was saying. They couldn't keep going down the same path, using the same tools that had led to humanity's downfall in the first place. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and filled with tension. "So what do we do?" Elara looked down at the device in Kael's hand, the faint pulse of light casting shadows on their faces. "We don't use it," she said softly. "At least, not in the way we've been using technology before. We need to find a new way, one that doesn't rely on control or domination. One that allows us to coexist with this world, rather than trying to bend it to our will." Kael frowned, but there was a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He didn't fully agree yet, he wasn't ready to let go of the fight, but he was starting to see the bigger picture. "And if we're wrong?" he asked quietly. Elara shrugged, her expression grim. "Then we die, just like the rest of them." They stood there in silence for a long time, the weight of the decision pressing down on them both. The path ahead was unclear, fraught with danger and uncertainty. But for the first time, Elara felt a sense of clarity. They couldn't keep fighting this world, couldn't keep using the old ways to survive. If they were going to make it, they had to find a new way forward, one that embraced the changes happening around them, rather than trying to resist them. And deep down, Kael knew she was right. The air tasted of iron, thick with the scent of decay, as Elara and Kael trudged through the dense forest. Once, this place had been lush, vibrant with life, but now the earth seemed to rot beneath their feet. The trees were twisted into grotesque shapes, their bark brittle and blackened. The leaves, once green, had taken on a metallic sheen, curling inward like dead flesh. Even the wind carried a hollow sound, as if it too had lost its vitality. Elara's breath hitched as they continued, her legs aching from the endless walking. She couldn't remember the last time they had stopped. Days? Hours? It was all a blur. The passage of time had become meaningless in this world. There was no dawn or dusk, only the oppressive gray sky that seemed to stretch endlessly overhead, casting the world in perpetual twilight. Beside her, Kael moved with a kind of practiced efficiency, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. His grip on his weapon never loosened, the tension in his muscles visible even through his worn clothes. Every sound, a rustle in the bushes, the distant howl of a creature, set him on edge. "They're getting closer," Kael muttered, more to himself than to her. Elara glanced at him, noting the lines etched into his face, the weariness in his eyes. She could see the weight he carried, the burden of always having to be the protector. There was no room for softness in him anymore, no space for vulnerability. He was all sharp edges now, hardened by the constant threat of death that surrounded them. "You don't have to do this alone, you know," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the wind. Kael didn't respond at first, his gaze still fixed on the path ahead. He had always been like this, closed off, stoic. But she had come to know him well enough to see the cracks beneath the surface, the small moments when the mask slipped. "I know," he finally said, though his tone lacked conviction. Elara wanted to press him, to reach out and make him see that he didn't always have to be the strong one. But something held her back. Maybe it was fear of what might happen if they let their guard down, even for a moment. Or maybe it was something deeper, something she couldn't quite name. As they walked, the silence between them grew heavier, thick with unspoken thoughts and buried emotions. It was always like this between them, words left unsaid, feelings unexpressed. And yet, there was a strange comfort in that silence, a mutual understanding that neither of them was ready to admit what was truly in their hearts. The ground beneath them shifted suddenly, and Elara stumbled, catching herself on a nearby tree. The bark crumbled beneath her touch, disintegrating into dust. She pulled her hand back quickly, her pulse quickening. "Careful," Kael said, his voice sharp. He was beside her in an instant, his hand on her arm, steadying her. Elara looked up at him, her breath catching in her throat. His face was close to hers, closer than it had been in a long time. For a moment, the world around them seemed to fade, and all she could see was him, the man who had fought beside her, bled beside her, the man she had come to rely on in ways she never thought possible. "Thanks," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Kael's grip on her arm loosened, but he didn't step away. His gaze lingered on her face, his expression unreadable. There was something in his eyes, something that made her heart skip a beat. Was it fear? Or was it something else, something more dangerous? "Elara," he began, his voice low, but he stopped himself, as if unsure of what he wanted to say. She waited, her heart pounding in her chest, but he remained silent. The moment stretched on, taut with tension, until finally Kael stepped back, his hand falling away from her arm. "We should keep moving," he said gruffly, turning away before she could respond. Elara exhaled slowly, the moment slipping away like water through her fingers. She watched him for a moment longer before following, her mind swirling with 1,000 thoughts. The sun had not shone in weeks. Not that it mattered anymore. Day and night had long since become irrelevant, swallowed by the constant grayness that now permeated the atmosphere. As they moved deeper into the forest, the trees grew closer together, their twisted branches forming a canopy overhead that blocked out what little light remained. Elara could feel the weight of the world pressing down on her, suffocating her. Every breath felt like a struggle, as if the air itself had become toxic. She glanced at Kael, wondering how he managed to keep going, to keep fighting when everything around them seemed to be falling apart. It was in moments like these, when the world felt like it was teetering on the edge of collapse, that she found herself thinking about the past, about the world that had been and the people they had lost. She thought about her family, long gone now, their faces fading from her memory with each passing day. She thought about the life she had once imagined for herself, before everything had changed. And then she thought about Kael. They had been through so much together, survived things that should have killed them 100 times over. And yet, here they were, still standing, still fighting. She wondered what that meant, if it meant anything at all. "Do you ever think about the future?" she asked suddenly, the words spilling out before she could stop them. Kael glanced at her, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "I mean, do you ever think about what comes next, after all this?" He was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the path ahead. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost distant. "There's no future, Elara, not for people like us." She frowned, taken aback by the harshness of his words. "You don't believe that," she said, though even as she spoke, she wasn't sure if she believed it herself. Kael stopped walking, turning to face her. His expression was hard, his eyes cold. "Look around you, Elara. This world is dying. We're dying. There's nothing left for us." She stared at him, her chest tightening. "So what? We just give up? Is that what you're saying?" "I'm saying we survive. That's all we can do." Elara shook her head, her frustration boiling over. "That's not enough, Kael. Surviving isn't enough. We have to believe in something more, or else, what's the point?" "The point is to stay alive," Kael shot back, his voice rising. "That's all that matters now. You think love, hope, any of that matters in a world like this? It's a luxury we can't afford." His words stung, cutting deeper than she expected. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. He was wrong. He had to be wrong. But as she stood there, staring at the man she had come to care for more than she wanted to admit, she realized that maybe he wasn't. Maybe love was a luxury. Maybe it was something they couldn't afford in a world like this. But even as the thought crossed her mind, she rejected it. Love wasn't a luxury. It was the only thing that made this hell worth surviving. Without it, what was the point of any of this? "I don't believe that," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "I can't believe that." Kael's expression softened, just for a moment, but it was enough. Enough for her to see the fear behind his eyes. The fear that had been driving him all this time. The fear of losing everything. Of losing her. "Elara," he said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. I can't lose you." Her heart clenched at his words, and for a moment, she forgot where they were, forgot about the dying world around them. All she could see was him, the man who had been her constant in a world that had fallen apart. The man who, despite everything, had stayed by her side. "You won't," she whispered, stepping closer to him. "I'm not going anywhere." They stood there, close enough to feel each other's breath, the space between them charged with an intensity that neither of them could deny. And in that moment, amidst the chaos and destruction, there was a brief reprieve, a moment where nothing else mattered but the two of them. But it didn't last. A rustling in the bushes shattered the fragile peace, and in an instant, Kael's weapon was raised, his body tense and ready. Elara followed suit, her heart pounding in her chest. They were not alone. The creatures emerged from the shadows, their forms sleek and predatory, their eyes glowing with an eerie light. These were not the mindless beasts they had encountered before. These were hunters, evolved specifically to track and kill humans. Kael's grip tightened on his weapon, his gaze locked on the creatures. "Stay close," he muttered to Elara, his voice low and controlled. They moved as one, their bodies perfectly synchronized as they backed away from the approaching predators. Alara's heart raced, her mind screaming at her to run, to flee, but she held her ground, her weapon raised and ready. The first creature lunged, its movements fluid and deadly. Kael reacted instantly, his weapon firing with deadly precision, taking the beast down in a single shot. But there were more, too many to count. Elara fired, her shots hitting their marks, but the creatures kept coming, their eyes fixed on their prey. She could feel the panic rising in her chest, but she pushed it down, focusing on the fight. There was no room for fear here, not if they wanted to survive. By the time the last of the creatures lay dead at their feet, Elara's body was shaking with exhaustion. Her hands trembled as she lowered her weapon, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Kael stood beside her, his chest heaving, but his expression was as calm and controlled as ever. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice steady despite the chaos they had just endured. Elara nodded, though she wasn't sure if she was telling the truth. Her body ached, her mind felt like it was fraying at the edges, but she was still standing, still alive. "For now?" Kael reached out, his hand brushing against her arm. It was a small gesture, but in that moment it felt like everything. A reminder that they were still here, still fighting, together. "Elara," he said softly, his eyes locking onto hers. There was something in his gaze, something that made her heart skip a beat. It was the same look he had given her earlier, when they had stood so close, when the world had seemed to fall away. He began, but whatever he was about to say was cut off by a sudden, sharp cry in the distance. Both of them turned, their weapons raised once more. There was no time for words, no time for anything but survival. The forest breathed. With every gust of wind, the branches swayed, their leaves whispering secrets known only to the earth. Sunlight filtered through the thick canopy, casting patterns of gold on the forest floor. It was a peaceful scene, deceptively calm, so unlike the turmoil brewing among the survivors. The serenity outside was a stark contrast to the tension within their group. Elara crouched low, her eyes sweeping the undergrowth for any sign of movement. She had always felt the weight of nature, even when it seemed to ignore them. It was as if the very earth beneath her feet was watching, waiting. She used to believe the forest was neutral, an indifferent bystander to the struggles of humanity. But now she wasn't so sure. Kael stood a few paces behind her, silent, his gaze distant. They hadn't spoken much since the fight with the creatures. It was easier to lose oneself in the rhythm of survival than confront the uncomfortable thoughts that lingered just beneath the surface. He was different now, colder, more detached, and Elara felt the creeping suspicion that he was holding back, hiding something from her, something that gnawed at the fragile trust between them. The others were scattered throughout the perimeter, keeping watch as they always did. But it was Jalen who had been acting the strangest. He was quieter than usual, keeping to himself more often, his gaze often fixed on the distance, as if he saw something none of them could. Elara had dismissed it at first, thinking it was just the toll of survival, the weight of everything pressing down on them. But now, the unease that she had been pushing aside was impossible to ignore. And then came the sound, soft, almost imperceptible, like the murmur of the trees. It wasn't an alarm, not at first. But something in the air shifted, and instinctively, Elara straightened. Her hand moved to the grip of her weapon, but she hesitated. A figure stepped out from the shadows of the trees, moving with a deliberate calm. It was Jalen. Elara's breath hitched. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes, they had changed. There was a strange light in them, something foreign. He didn't look at her or Kael. Instead, his gaze drifted to the forest behind them, to the vast, living world that surrounded them. "I didn't think it would come to this," he said quietly, his voice barely more than a breath. "But maybe this is how it was always meant to be." Kael stepped forward, his expression hardening. "What are you talking about?" Jalen's eyes met his, and for the first time in days, he smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "Nature doesn't need us, Kael. It never did. We're intruders here, parasites. And the earth, it's fighting back." Elara felt her heart pound in her chest, the weight of his words pressing down on her like a vice. She had heard similar thoughts before, but never from Jalen. He had always been the one who fought the hardest, who had clung to the hope that they could survive this. To hear this from him now. "You don't mean that," Elara said, though her voice wavered. "We're fighting to live, Jalen. We have to. The creatures, this planet, it's trying to kill us." Jalen shook his head slowly, his eyes distant again. "No, we've been killing it for centuries. This is balance, Elara. We're the disease, and the earth is just trying to heal itself." Kael's grip tightened on his weapon. "This is madness. You've been out here too long. You've seen what this planet is capable of. It's not healing anything, it's wiping us out." "Maybe it should," Jalen replied softly. His words hung in the air, heavy with conviction. "Maybe that's what should have happened a long time ago." Elara's chest tightened, her mind racing. She had never seen Jalen like this, so resigned, so sure of something that felt wrong. She glanced at Kael, hoping for some sign that he understood, that he would talk Jalen down from whatever edge he was standing on. But Kael was quiet, his eyes focused on the ground, as if he were considering something deeply, too deeply. The silence stretched between them, growing unbearable. "You're serious," Kael finally said, his voice low. He wasn't asking, it was a statement. Elara knew that tone, knew the weight it carried. "You think we should just give up? Let the planet take us?" Jalen's eyes softened, and for a brief moment, Elara saw the man she had once known, the friend, the fighter. "I think we've lost our place, Kael. I think, maybe we never belonged here in the first place." Kael didn't respond immediately. His jaw clenched, and Elara could see the battle waging inside him. She could feel it too, that creeping doubt, the whisper of something she had been trying to ignore for so long. They were fighting for survival, yes, but against what? A planet that was fighting back, a world that seemed determined to shake them off like fleas. "Kael," she said quietly, hoping to snap him out of whatever thoughts were clouding his mind. "You don't actually agree with him, do you?" For a moment, Kael's eyes met hers, and what she saw there made her blood run cold. There was hesitation, a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come right away. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what to believe anymore." Elara's heart sank. She had been bracing for this, had felt the cracks forming between them for days now. But hearing it out loud, it was like a blow to the chest. "Kael." Before she could finish, Jalen spoke again, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "The creatures we've been fighting, they're not monsters. They're part of this place, a part of the balance we've disrupted. We've become the monsters, Elara. We take, we destroy, and now the earth is reclaiming what's hers." Elara shook her head, refusing to accept it. That's not true. We're trying to survive, Jalen, that's all. Jalen's eyes darkened, his calm demeanor slipping for the first time. At what cost, Elara? How many lives have been taken for the sake of humanity's survival? How much destruction have we caused just to stay alive a little longer? When does it end? The weight of his words pressed down on her, suffocating. She wanted to argue, to fight back against the doubts clawing at her mind. But the truth was, she didn't have an answer, not anymore. Kael was still silent, his gaze fixed on the ground. Elara could feel the distance between them growing, the betrayal sinking in like a knife between her ribs. She had trusted him, believed that they were fighting for the same thing, for survival, for each other. But now? I won't be a part of this anymore, Jalen said, his voice steady. I'm going to the forest. I'll join them, the creatures. I'll be part of what's left. Elara's heart raced. You can't be serious, Jalen. They'll kill you. No, Jalen said, shaking his head. They won't. I've watched them, studied them. They're not like us. They're not driven by fear or greed. They're just alive. I think, if I can show them I'm not a threat, they'll let me stay. You don't know that, Elara snapped, desperation creeping into her voice. This is suicide. Jalen smiled again, that same sad, knowing smile. Maybe, but I'd rather die as part of something real, something natural, than live as part of this lie. Before she could respond, Jalen turned and walked into the forest, his figure swallowed by the shadows. Elara stared after him, her mind racing, her body frozen. The betrayal hung in the air, suffocating. She had lost a friend. No, not just a friend, but something more. The certainty that they were all in this together, fighting for the same goal, had been shattered. And Kael hadn't stopped him. Elara turned to Kael, her voice trembling. You should have said something. Kael looked at her, his expression unreadable. What could I have said, Elara? He made his choice. Did you want him to go? She demanded, anger and hurt bubbling to the surface. Do you agree with him? Kael didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with exhaustion. I don't know anymore. Maybe he's right. Elara felt the ground shift beneath her feet, her world crumbling. She had trusted Kael, believed in him. But now, standing there in the quiet, watching as the forest seemed to swallow Jalen whole, she realized she didn't know him at all. The air was thick with tension, and a heavy silence settled over the survivors as they crouched low beneath the overgrown canopy. Every breath felt measured, every sound they made carried the risk of exposure. Shadows danced on the forest floor, but the threat looming over them wasn't something as simple as darkness. It was the faint hum of something far worse, something that no longer belonged to the natural order. Elara's fingers tightened around the hilt of her knife, though she knew it would do little good. The weight of the decision she would have to make bore down on her, suffocating. Somewhere in the distance, the predator moved, its presence felt in the vibrating earth, its intent clear. It hunted them, and it was patient. It had taken days, maybe weeks, to track them, though no one could be sure anymore. Time had become meaningless in their desperate existence. What was clear, however, was the nature of the thing hunting them. It wasn't just an animal. It was more, something that didn't fit into the neat categories of predator and prey. This creature had been designed, built to merge the precision of machines with the instincts of a beast. It was Earth's final creation, the culmination of nature's will fused with humanity's discarded technology. The ultimate predator, and it was hunting them now. The sound of its approach, distant but constant, was a reminder that they were running out of time. Kael stood beside her, eyes locked on the horizon as though searching for answers in the dimming light. His jaw was clenched, his thoughts clearly heavy. There had been few words exchanged between them since Jalen's departure, but now they were bound by the choice looming over them. A choice that weighed on them all. It was inevitable that the question would come. It always did. Elara, he said quietly, barely above a whisper, we have to talk about it. She didn't respond immediately. The weight of his words fell on her like a slow-building pressure, one that had been growing from the moment the predator had appeared. She had known this was coming, that their survival would come at a cost. Yet knowing didn't make it any easier. "We're not having this conversation," Elara replied, though her voice lacked conviction. She could feel the trembling in her hands. Kael's gaze remained fixed ahead, but his words were sharp, cutting through the silence between them. "We don't have time for this, Elara. If we don't decide now, we're all dead." Her chest tightened. "I'm not making that choice." A few feet away, Elara knelt beside a fallen tree, her breath shallow, her skin pale. She had taken a hit in the last skirmish with one of the smaller creatures, and though they had managed to stop the bleeding, infection was setting in. The others tried not to look at her, though they all knew what was happening. They knew that she was slowing them down, knew what that meant. Elara's thoughts churned, her mind racing with the unbearable conflict. How had it come to this? How had they been reduced to something so primitive, deciding who lived and who died, all in the name of survival? Her stomach twisted. "I'm not leaving anyone behind," she said, the words forced, her voice wavering. She was lying to herself as much as she was lying to Kael. Kael finally turned to look at her. His eyes, usually so full of determination, were now clouded with doubt. "And if we don't leave her behind, none of us are going to make it. You know that." His words felt like a knife twisting inside her. She didn't want to admit it, but he was right. Elara was too weak to keep moving, and every second they delayed was a second the predator grew closer. There would be no escape if they didn't act soon. Across the clearing, Ren and Terran huddled together, whispering between themselves. Ren's face was pale, his eyes darting around as though he could feel the predator watching them. Terran's hands shook, though whether from fear or exhaustion, Elara couldn't tell. The group was breaking, and she could see it happening right in front of her. And then, like a ghost passing through her mind, Jalen's voice echoed in her thoughts. "At what cost?" he had asked, and now the answer seemed to be staring her in the face. Kael's voice pulled her back into the present. "We have to decide now, before it's too late." Her body felt heavy as she looked at Elara. Her eyes were closed, her breath shallow but steady. She was too weak to fight, too far gone to even know what was being discussed. Would it be a mercy, then, to leave her behind, to spare her the inevitable horror of what was coming? But was it mercy, or was it selfishness? Elara didn't know anymore. The hum of the predator's mechanical parts seemed louder now, closer. Time was slipping away. "We can still find another way," Elara said, though the words rang hollow in the suffocating silence. She didn't believe them herself, but saying them out loud made it feel as though she hadn't completely abandoned her humanity. Kael stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "There is no other way, Elara. We have to think about the group, about survival." Her vision blurred as her heart pounded in her chest. Survival. The word felt foreign now, a mockery of what it once meant. Once, survival had been about holding on to hope, about fighting for each other. But now it felt like something else, something darker. "What good is surviving if we have to become like this?" Elara whispered, her voice barely audible. Kael's face softened, but there was no reassurance in his eyes. "It's not about good or bad anymore. It's just about living. Living. Just living." Was that enough? A movement in the trees caught her attention, and suddenly the predator was no longer an abstract threat, but a very real one. It moved silently through the undergrowth, its body a grotesque fusion of steel and flesh, like something pulled from a nightmare. Its form was sleek, predatory, with long limbs ending in razor-sharp claws. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, scanning the terrain with cold precision. It was an abomination of nature and technology, something that shouldn't have existed, but did. A creation designed for one purpose, to hunt, and it had found them. Elara's throat tightened, and panic clawed at her chest. The predator moved with a grace that was almost beautiful, its mechanical limbs moving in perfect sync with its organic parts. It was efficient, cold, and completely devoid of mercy. She knew, in that moment, what had to be done. The others would never outrun it. not with delay in tow. Even if they tried to carry her, the predator would close the gap in seconds. Their only chance, no, not a chance, a certainty, was to leave her behind. Her mind raced, grasping for an alternative, but there wasn't one. Not this time. The predator was closing in, and the group was on the verge of collapse. If they hesitated, if they faltered for even a moment, it would all be over. Elara felt her legs move before her mind fully processed what she was doing. She crossed the clearing and knelt beside Delaz, her heart heavy with the weight of what was coming. Delaz's eyes fluttered open, her gaze distant and unfocused. She didn't speak, didn't ask what was happening. Maybe she already knew. Maybe she had known for a while. Elara swallowed hard. "We're going to get you out of here, Delaz," she said, though her voice betrayed her. The lie burned her throat, but it was the only thing she could give her in this moment. The others watched in silence, their faces pale, their eyes haunted. They knew, too. They had all known the moment the predator appeared. There was no argument, no protest. They were too far gone for that now. The only thing left was to make peace with the choice. The predator's hum grew louder, its glowing eyes now visible through the thick trees. Elara stood, her legs shaky, her mind numb. She could feel Kael's gaze on her, but she didn't look at him. She couldn't. "We have to go," Ren said, his voice tight with fear. "It's here." Elara nodded, her body moving on instinct as they turned away from Delaz and began to run. The world around her blurred, her vision tunneling as adrenaline surged through her veins. The hum of the predator filled her ears, its presence growing closer with every step. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The sound of claws tearing through flesh echoed in the air, and Elara's heart shattered. They ran. They didn't stop. As the forest swallowed them, Elara's mind wandered, her thoughts spinning out of control. The predator had been built to hunt, to cull the weak, to ensure that only the strongest survived. But was that what survival really was? The act of living, at any cost? Was survival worth it if it came at the price of their humanity? She couldn't shake the image of Delaz, lying there in the dirt, her life slipping away as they fled. Was that what it had come to? Was this the kind of world they were trying to survive in? A world where the only rule was that the strong must feed on the weak, where mercy was a luxury they could no longer afford. Kael caught up to her, his breath coming in quick gasps. "We have to keep moving," he said, urgency flooding his voice. "Did you see her?" Elara shot back, her words filled with despair. "Did you see what we just did?" Kael's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. They both knew what had happened, the truth looming over them like a dark cloud. "Survival at any cost?" she pressed. "Is that what you want?" Kael looked away, and she could see the struggle in his eyes. "What choice do we have? What else can we do?" Elara's heart sank, a weight forming in her chest. "We're losing ourselves." A roar echoed through the trees, and the ground shook beneath them. The predator was relentless, its pursuit fueled by instincts they could scarcely comprehend. Elara's thoughts raced, caught in a whirlwind of fear and despair. They had lost one of their own, and the cost of that decision felt too great to bear. In that moment, the question burned within her. What did it mean to survive? Was survival merely the act of breathing, or was it something deeper, something intertwined with compassion, empathy, and the ties that bound them together as a group? Her chest heaved, and she pushed forward, her legs moving on autopilot as her mind spiraled. They had become hunters, yes, but at what point had they lost sight of what it meant to be human? The predator roared again, a chilling sound that resonated deep within her bones. It was a reminder that they were not just fighting for survival, they were fighting against the very nature of what they had become. In the distance, a faint glow flickered through the trees. Hope ignited within her, a flicker of something that felt like possibility. If they could just reach that light, perhaps they could find safety. Perhaps they could find redemption. But in the back of her mind, a nagging thought persisted: at what cost? The glow grew closer, the trees parting to reveal a small clearing. Elara's heart raced as she spotted the remnants of an ancient structure, a fragment of the past standing defiantly against the encroaching wilderness. The crumbling stone walls whispered of a time before the world had turned against itself, before humanity had made the choices that had led them to this point. "Over here," Kael shouted, breaking her reverie. They pushed into the clearing, their bodies fueled by adrenaline. But the predator was close behind. Its breath was a low growl, echoing through the trees, sending a shiver down her spine. They had reached the remnants of the past, but would it be enough to protect them from the future? Elara felt a surge of desperation as they reached the stone structure, the weight of their choices pressing down on her. They couldn't let their humanity slip away, couldn't allow themselves to become mere instruments of survival. In that moment, she understood. The true cost of survival wasn't measured in lives lost, but in the hearts and souls that remained. As they huddled against the stone walls, Elara looked at Kael, their eyes meeting with unspoken understanding. They had to find a way to redefine what survival meant. It wasn't just about living, it was about living with purpose, with connection, and with the weight of their choices. And as the predator closed in, they would have to fight, not just for their lives, but for the very essence of what it meant to be human. In that critical moment, Elara felt a shift within herself. No longer would she stand idly by, burdened by the choices made in desperation. She would fight for Elara, for their shared humanity, for the future they could still reclaim. They would not become monsters in a world that sought to consume them. They would redefine survival together. The air was thick, an oppressive heat that clung to their skin, making every breath a struggle. Elara wiped the sweat from her brow, her eyes scanning the desolate landscape before them. The group stood at the edge of a vast chasm, its depths obscured by a swirling mist that seemed alive, shifting and moving, as if it harbored secrets too ancient to be comprehended. This was the heart of Earth's deadliest terrain, a place where life had evolved not to coexist, but to dominate, consume, and kill. Elara looked at the others, Kael, whose stoic face masked the turmoil beneath, Delaz, still shaken from their recent loss, and Sarah, whose wide eyes betrayed her fear. None of them spoke, but the weight of their collective dread was palpable. They had known this journey would test them, but nothing had prepared them for this. The landscape was a grotesque parody of life. Trees twisted into unnatural forms, their bark appearing to writhe like flesh. The ground was littered with bones, both animal and something unrecognizable, remnants of things that had come before, creatures who had met their end in this unforgiving place. And yet, amidst the death and decay, there was a haunting beauty. Vines glistened with a strange, bioluminescent light, casting an eerie glow that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the earth itself. "This is it, then," Kael muttered, his voice barely audible. "The abyss." Elara nodded, but her mind was elsewhere, drifting on a tide of thoughts that had begun to plague her since they had crossed into this forsaken territory. Humanity had always seen itself as the apex, the pinnacle of evolution. But now, as she stood in this place where life had adapted in ways that defied understanding, she couldn't help but question that assumption. Could they still claim dominance in a world that had moved on without them, leaving them behind like a relic of a forgotten era? Delaz shifted uneasily. "We should keep moving. Standing here, it doesn't feel safe." No one disagreed. They pressed forward, each step careful, as if the ground itself might rise up to swallow them whole. The mist swirled thicker as they descended deeper into the abyss, obscuring their surroundings. Elara's senses heightened, every sound amplified, the soft crunch of their boots against the soil, the distant calls of creatures unseen, the ever-present hum of something ancient and unknowable. As they ventured further, the terrain became more erratic. The air grew warmer, the ground more treacherous. Strange, pulsing plants jutted from the earth, their tendrils brushing against their legs as if tasting them. Occasionally, they would catch glimpses of movement in the fog, brief flashes of shadows darting between the trees, too fast to be identified. Elara felt her chest tighten with each passing minute. There was no way to know what awaited them, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. It wasn't just the creatures they couldn't see, but the earth itself, an entity vast and indifferent, regarding them with a gaze as old as time. "Do you feel it?" Sarah asked quietly, her voice barely a whisper. Like, we don't belong here. Kael cast her a glance, but said nothing. He didn't need to. The truth of it hung in the air, unspoken. They were intruders in a world that had no use for them. A world that had evolved beyond the need for humans, where everything that lived was designed to thrive in their absence. Elara couldn't shake the thought. What was humanity's place in this world? They had fought, struggled, and survived for so long. But was survival even the point anymore? Was there a greater purpose to their existence, or were they merely prolonging the inevitable? They reached a narrow pass, the walls of the chasm rising steeply on either side. The mist clung to the rock, thickening as they moved deeper into the abyss. It was hard to tell how far they had come or how much further they had to go. Time felt distorted here, stretched thin by the oppressive atmosphere. Suddenly, a low growl echoed through the mist. The group froze, hearts pounding. The sound was deep, guttural, and too close for comfort. "What was that?" Elara whispered, her hand instinctively reaching for her weapon. Before anyone could answer, the ground trembled beneath them. Elara's breath hitched, and she felt a cold sweat break out across her skin. They weren't alone. Out of the mist emerged a creature unlike anything they had seen before. It stood on 4 legs, its body sleek and muscular, covered in a hide that shimmered in the dim light. Its eyes, bright and predatory, locked onto them with an unsettling intelligence. This was not an animal acting on instinct alone. It was something more. For a moment, no one moved. The creature stared them down, its breath heavy and calculated. Then, without warning, it lunged. Kael reacted first, firing a shot into the creature's path. It howled in pain but didn't stop. It was relentless, driven by a hunger that seemed boundless. Elara dove to the side, narrowly avoiding its claws as it swiped at her. The others scattered, the group momentarily separated in the chaos. Elara's heart raced, her mind flashing through every possible outcome, none of them good. This wasn't a fight they could win, not in this terrain, not against something that had been shaped by the very forces they now feared. But as she ducked behind a rock, catching her breath, a strange calmness settled over her. What were they really fighting for? Their lives, of course, but wasn't there something more fundamental at play? A deeper, existential question gnawed at her, one that had been lingering beneath the surface for far too long. Was survival enough? Or had they lost something more precious in their desperate attempt to cling to life? The creature roared again, but this time it was met with a sharp cry from Kael. He had wounded it, if only slightly, buying them precious seconds to regroup. "Over here," he called, waving them toward a narrow gap in the rocks. Elara didn't hesitate. She sprinted toward him, Delay and Sira close behind. Together, they squeezed through the gap, the creature's enraged howls fading as they put distance between themselves and the threat. For now, at least, they were safe. The group collapsed on the ground, gasping for air. The chasm had opened into a wide, open cavern, its walls lined with strange bioluminescent flora. The light cast an ethereal glow, illuminating the jagged rocks that jutted out from the ground like teeth. Elara leaned against the cool stone, her mind spinning. She couldn't stop the questions from surfacing. What had they become? What was their place in a world that no longer had room for them? "We can't keep doing this," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Kael looked at her, his face hard, but his eyes betraying a flicker of understanding. "We don't have a choice." "Don't we?" Elara pressed. "This isn't survival anymore. It's something else. Something darker." Dela, still shaken, nodded slowly. "We've lost too much. And for what? To live another day? Is that really enough?" Kael's jaw clenched. "It's all we have." Elara shook her head, her heart heavy with the weight of their situation. "No. We have more than that. We have each other. We have our humanity. But if we keep going like this, we're going to lose that, too." The silence that followed was suffocating. Each of them knew the truth of her words, but no one wanted to admit it. They had been so focused on survival that they had forgotten to ask what it truly meant to live. "We don't belong here," Sira said quietly, her voice trembling. "This world, It's not ours anymore. Elara's gaze drifted to the glowing plants, their soft light flickering like dying stars. She felt a deep, aching sadness settle over her. Syrah was right. This wasn't their world, not anymore. They were outsiders, relics of a past that no longer had a place in the present. But even as the despair threatened to consume her, a new thought took hold. Maybe their insignificance was the key. Maybe the question wasn't about reclaiming their place in this world, but about finding peace in letting go. They had been fighting so hard to survive, to prove that humanity still had a role to play. But what if their purpose was to accept that the world had moved on? What if we stopped fighting? Elara asked, the words slipping from her lips before she could fully grasp their weight. Kael frowned. What are you saying? I'm saying, maybe we're not supposed to survive this. Maybe we're meant to let go, to accept that our time has passed. The idea hung in the air, heavy and uncomfortable. It was a radical thought, one that went against everything they had been taught about survival, about resilience, about the indomitable human spirit. But in this place, surrounded by a world that had evolved beyond their comprehension, it didn't seem so far-fetched. Let go, Dela whispered, her voice tinged with both fear and curiosity. You mean, die? Elara shook her head. Not die. Just stop trying to control everything. Stop trying to impose our will on a world that no longer needs us. Maybe that's the answer. Maybe that's the only way we can truly find peace. Kael stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he nodded. Maybe, but that's a choice we can't make lightly. Elara felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid. Maybe they didn't have to fight anymore. Maybe they could simply be. As the mist swirled around them and the bioluminescent plants pulsed with life, Elara realized that the answer had been in front of them all along. Humanity's place in this world wasn't about dominance or survival, it was about acceptance. About understanding their role in the grand design, even if that role was smaller than they had ever imagined. In the silence that followed, they sat together, not as survivors, but as part of something much larger, something they couldn't fully comprehend. And for the first time, they allowed themselves to simply exist, without fear, without resistance, without the need to prove anything. They had ventured into the abyss, and in doing so, they had found their answer. The atmosphere inside the vault was suffocating. A stale, metallic tang hung in the air, infused with the faint scent of old machinery. The walls, once a gleaming testament to human engineering, were now etched with the wear of centuries. Dust coated every surface, and the dim light from flickering emergency lamps only accentuated the room's decay. The vault had been sealed long ago, designed to protect and preserve what was left of humanity's achievements. But now it felt more like a tomb, a relic from a time when humans still believed they ruled the earth. Elara stood near the central console, her fingers brushing against the smooth, cold metal of the interface. The intricate symbols and long-forgotten codes were displayed across the screen, most of them unintelligible now. They had come here seeking refuge, but it was clear that this vault was never meant to house the living. It was a storage place for history, a sanctuary for knowledge. Yet in this moment, it had become their last hope for survival. Outside, the ground trembled. A low, distant rumble echoed through the walls, growing louder with each passing second. The creatures were coming, Earth's evolved predators, beasts that had risen from the ashes of human civilization, shaped by millennia of brutal natural selection. They were unlike anything Elara had encountered, creatures that thrived in the harshest conditions, born from an environment where survival meant adapting in ways humanity could never have anticipated. How long do we have? Kael's voice was quiet but tense, cutting through the heavy silence of the room. Elara turned to him, her expression hard. Not long. Maybe minutes. Kael nodded, his gaze shifting toward the entrance. It was barricaded, reinforced with whatever scraps of metal and debris they could find. But they both knew it wouldn't hold. The predators outside, beasts with sinew that could tear through steel and teeth capable of grinding bone to dust, would break through eventually. It was only a matter of time. Dilla and Sira sat huddled together by the far wall, their faces pale and drawn. Dilla clutched a weapon tightly in her hands, her knuckles white from the pressure. Sira, her eyes wide with fear, whispered something under her breath, perhaps a prayer, or perhaps just a desperate attempt to cling to hope. Elara felt the weight of their situation pressing down on her. This wasn't just another battle for survival. This was the end. The last stand. If they failed here, there would be nothing left. No one to remember them. No legacy, no future. Just the creatures outside, waiting to devour whatever remained. She stepped away from the console, moving toward Kael. His jaw was clenched, the muscles in his neck tight. He had always been the steady one, the unshakable rock in the face of chaos. But now, even he seemed frayed at the edges, worn down by the relentless toll of their journey. "We can't keep running," Elara said quietly, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. Kael met her gaze, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. "We have no choice. If we stay here, we die." Elara shook her head. "No. We make our stand here. This is where we draw the line." Kael hesitated, glancing toward the others. "We're not soldiers, Elara. We can't win this fight." "We don't need to win. We just need to survive long enough to give humanity a chance." His eyes flickered with doubt, but he nodded. It was a silent agreement, one forged not from hope, but from necessity. They had no other options. The vault's defenses were rudimentary at best. The old security systems had long since failed, and the weapons they carried were limited. But Elara knew that their real advantage lay not in firepower, but in their ingenuity, the very trait that had allowed humanity to endure for so long. The predators outside were stronger, faster, and far more vicious than anything humans had ever faced. But they lacked the one thing that had defined humanity since the dawn of time, the ability to adapt, to innovate, to turn the impossible into the achievable. Elara crouched beside a panel on the far wall, prying it open with a rusted tool. Inside was a tangle of wires and circuits, most of them corroded or broken. She worked quickly, her hands steady despite the pounding in her chest. If she could reroute the power, if she could get the old systems back online, maybe, just maybe, they could hold the creatures off long enough to make a difference. Behind her, she heard Kael and Dilla moving into position, checking their weapons and preparing for the inevitable assault. The tension in the room was palpable, every breath a reminder of what was coming. But there was no panic, no fear in their movements. They had come too far, seen too much to let fear consume them now. As Elara worked, her mind drifted to the creatures outside. They were no longer just animals. Over centuries, they had evolved into something far more terrifying, predators perfectly attuned to the new Earth, with senses and reflexes that far surpassed anything humans had ever encountered. Their claws were sharper than steel, their skin as tough as armor, their eyes glowing with a predatory intelligence that sent shivers down Elara's spine. These weren't the beasts of stories or legends. They were real, and they were coming for them. Suddenly, the ground shook again, this time harder than before. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and the sound of tearing metal echoed through the vault. The creatures were at the barricade now, their monstrous forms slamming against the reinforced door with a force that made Elara's stomach lurch. "They're here," Dilla shouted, her voice edged with panic. Elara didn't look up. Her fingers flew across the panel, connecting wires and overriding circuits in a desperate attempt to activate the vault's ancient defense systems. A bead of sweat rolled down her forehead, but she didn't wipe it away. There was no time. The door groaned, metal shrieking as it bent under the pressure of the beast's assault. Kael stood ready, his weapon aimed at the entrance, but even he knew it was futile. The barricade would fail, and when it did, they would be overrun. Then, with a sudden flicker, the lights in the vault surged to life. Elara felt a surge of adrenaline as the ancient systems whirred to life, the hum of power coursing through the walls like a pulse. "Kael," she shouted, "get ready." The barricade buckled, and with a deafening crash, the creatures broke through. They were massive, their forms hunched and twisted, their eyes glowing in the dim light. Their jaws dripped with saliva, razor-sharp teeth gleaming as they roared in unison, a bone-chilling sound that echoed through the vault. But as they charged, the vault's defenses activated. A series of automated turrets descended from the ceiling, their barrels glowing with a soft, blue light. They whirred to life, spitting out streams of energy that tore through the creatures with deadly precision. The beasts screeched in pain, their massive bodies convulsing as they were hit. But still they kept coming, driven by an insatiable hunger. Kael fired his weapon, the recoil slamming into his shoulder as he aimed for the nearest predator. The shot hit its mark, searing through the creature's thick hide, but it barely slowed down. The others joined in, their weapons blazing as they fought to hold the creatures at bay. For a moment, it seemed like they had a chance. The automated defenses were holding, and the creatures, while powerful, were being cut down one by one. But Elara knew better. The vault systems were old, their power reserves limited. They couldn't hold out forever. "Fall back," she shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. "We need to conserve power." The group retreated deeper into the vault, their weapons still firing as they moved. The creatures, relentless as ever, followed, their glowing eyes fixed on their prey. Elara's heart pounded in her chest, every instinct screaming at her to run, to flee. But she couldn't. Not now, not when they were so close to the end. They reached the inner chamber, a vast, circular room filled with rows of ancient servers and data banks. This was the heart of the vault, the place where humanity's knowledge had been preserved. Elara stared at the towering machines, their screens flickering with lines of code and data, and felt a pang of sorrow. This was all that was left of them. Their legacy, their history, their achievements, stored in lifeless machines, guarded by systems that were now as ancient and fragile as the civilization they had once protected. The creatures roared again, their snarls echoing through the chamber as they closed in. Elara glanced at Kael, who was already moving toward the servers, his expression grim. "We can't let them get to this," he said, his voice low but steady. "If they destroy this, everything we've fought for is gone." Elara nodded, her mind racing. They had come so far, endured so much, but now it all hung in the balance. If the creatures reached the servers, it wouldn't just be their lives that were lost, it would be the legacy of humanity itself. "We need to lure them away," Elara said, her voice calm despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "We can't fight them here." Kael hesitated, his eyes flickering with doubt. "And if we can't?" Elara met his gaze, her expression hard. "Then we make sure they don't get what they came for." As the creatures closed in, Elara and Kael shared a final, silent moment of understanding. This was it, the last stand. The air inside the inner chamber was cold and sterile, a sharp contrast to the grimy, decaying vault they had just traversed. This place, hidden beneath layers of forgotten technology and time-worn systems, felt untouched by the erosion of centuries. As the group stepped through the archway, the dim light revealed rows of sealed containment pods, their surfaces coated in a thin layer of frost. The machinery hummed faintly, as if maintaining a fragile balance between life and death. Elara moved forward cautiously, her eyes scanning the unfamiliar room. It was larger than she had expected, almost cavernous, and the sterile glow of overhead lights reflected off the cold metal of the containment units. She could feel the quiet hum of old technology beneath her feet, the low vibration traveling up her spine, making her skin prickle with unease. The tension that had clung to them in the outer chamber still lingered, though this place held an unsettling calm. Kael stepped beside her, his hand brushing hers briefly before he withdrew it, letting his fingers rest against his weapon instead. His eyes remained fixed ahead, surveying the area with a measured gaze. Whatever secrets this room held, they were not what any of them had expected. "They're embryos," Cyril whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of awe and uncertainty as she stared at the nearest pod. The frost had begun to thaw, revealing a faint glow from within. "Human embryos." Elara's breath caught in her throat. It was as if she had been jolted into another time, a time long before she had been born, before humanity had lost its place on Earth. She knew the vault held knowledge, technology, relics of a past civilization. But this was something different entirely. This wasn't just the preservation of human history. This was a potential future, a future they had never imagined. They kept them, Elara murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. She took a step closer to the nearest pod, her fingers hovering above the frosted glass. All this time, they kept them. Kael exhaled slowly, the sound heavy in the silence. Not just kept, he said quietly, protected, preserved. Elara's mind raced as she processed what they were seeing. The implications were staggering. For centuries, humanity had believed it was on the verge of extinction. Its remaining descendants altered beyond recognition, scattered across a planet they could no longer claim as their own. But here, in this hidden vault, lay the last remnants of unaltered humanity, the genetic foundation of the species, preserved in a state of stasis for thousands of years. These embryos represented more than just life. They represented a decision, a choice that now rested in their hands. She turned toward Kael, searching his expression for some sign of what he was thinking. But his face remained unreadable, his jaw set as he stared at the pods. She knew what this discovery meant to him. They had always been fighting for survival, for a chance to keep living in a world that had moved on without them. But now, the stakes were different. This wasn't just about them anymore. This was about the future of an entire species. "Do we have the right to bring them back?" Elara asked, her voice steady, though she felt the weight of the question pressing down on her chest. "In a world that no longer belongs to them?" Kael's brow furrowed, and he looked at her for a long moment before speaking. "This world barely belongs to us," he said, his voice low. "What would it mean to bring them into it? To start over?" Elara considered his words carefully. They had spent their lives adapting to this new reality, a world shaped by the evolution of creatures far more attuned to survival than humanity ever was. The Earth had reclaimed itself, reshaping its inhabitants into something that could thrive in the ruins of the old world. Humans, as they had once been, were relics of the past. Their altered descendants, like Elara and Kael, had only survived by merging their biology with that of the creatures that now ruled the planet. "What kind of life would it be for them?" Sarah asked from behind them, her voice soft, but laden with concern. "They wouldn't survive. Not as they are." Elara crossed her arms, her gaze hardening. "And if they did, what then? They'd be starting over in a world where they're no longer at the top of the food chain. It's not just about surviving, they'd be hunted." Elara pressed a hand against her forehead, the tension building in her skull. The question that gnawed at her was far deeper than whether these embryos could survive. It was whether they should. What did it mean to resurrect an entire species when the world had moved on? Were they prolonging a legacy that no longer had a place in the future? She turned her gaze to the rows of pods once more. Behind the frosted glass, the faint shapes of unformed life lingered in suspension. They were innocent in all of this. Mere potential, untouched by the ravages of time and the cruelty of a world that had evolved without them. Could they, in good conscience, let these embryos die? Was it more ethical to let the past fade, or to attempt to recreate a species that nature had all but eliminated? "We'd be playing God," Kael said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but there was a gravity to his words that made Elara's chest tighten. "Deciding who gets to live, who gets to die. That's not a decision we can take lightly." Elara closed her eyes, the weight of the moral dilemma pressing against her mind like a storm. She had always believed in the resilience of humanity, their ability to endure, to adapt, to fight for survival in the face of impossible odds. But this wasn't just survival. This was something far more profound. They were being asked to decide the fate of an entire species, to determine whether humanity had a place in this new world, or whether it should be left to rest with the remnants of the past. "I don't know if we have the right to make that decision," Elara said softly. "But I also don't know if we have the right to just let them die." Kael nodded, his expression thoughtful. "We could bring them back," he said slowly. "Give them a chance to rebuild. But what kind of world would they be coming into? One where they're not the dominant species anymore. One where survival is a daily struggle, where they'd be the prey, not the predator. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken tension, the enormity of the decision hanging over them like a shadow. Elara could see the conflicting emotions in Kael's eyes, the deep, protective instinct to preserve life, and the cold, rational understanding that sometimes life wasn't enough. "What does it mean to be human?" Kael asked suddenly, his voice quiet but intense. "Is it our biology, our culture, our ability to adapt?" Elara looked at him, surprised by the question. It wasn't a question she had ever truly considered before, at least not in such stark terms. Humanity had always been defined by its resilience, by its ingenuity, by its capacity to adapt to the world around it. But now, in the face of extinction, those definitions felt inadequate. What did it mean to be human in a world that had outgrown humanity? "Maybe it's not about survival," Elara said slowly, her voice thoughtful. "Maybe it's about something more, something deeper." Kael raised an eyebrow, prompting her to continue. "What if being human isn't just about living?" she asked, her gaze fixed on the rows of embryos before them. "What if it's about the choices we make, about the legacy we leave behind? Maybe it's not enough to just survive. Maybe we have to decide what kind of world we want to live in, and whether that world has a place for us." Kael was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant. Then, he nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. "And if the world doesn't have a place for us?" he asked quietly. Elara's chest tightened, her heart pounding in her ears. It was a question she didn't want to face, but one she knew they couldn't avoid. The world had moved on. The creatures that now roamed the earth were stronger, faster, more adaptable than humans had ever been. They were the future, not the embryos suspended in the containment pods. But did that mean humanity didn't have a place in that future? Or did it mean they had to create one? "I don't know," Elara admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But maybe it's not about whether the world has a place for us. Maybe it's about whether we're willing to make one." The room fell into a heavy silence once more, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The rows of embryos seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, their presence a silent reminder of the choice that lay before them. Kael's hand found hers again, and this time he didn't pull away. His grip was firm, steady, grounding her in the midst of the chaos swirling in her mind. "We don't have to decide right now," he said softly, his voice gentle. "But whatever we choose, we'll do it together." Elara nodded, her heart aching with the weight of their decision. The future of humanity rested in their hands, but it wasn't a decision they could make lightly. It wasn't just about survival. It was about something deeper, something that went beyond biology, beyond genetics. It was about what it meant to be human, and whether that meaning still had a place in the world they had inherited. As they stood together, the hum of the ancient technology beneath their feet, Elara couldn't help but wonder if the answer lay not in the embryos before them, but in the choices they would make in the days to come. The air inside the vault remained still, suffused with an unnatural calm, as if the world outside had forgotten this place existed. Kael's hands pressed against the cold steel surface of the pod, his breath shallow and uneven. He hadn't moved since they made the decision to leave the embryos undisturbed, for now. But there was something else at work in him, something far deeper than mere hesitation or reflection. Elara stood behind him, watching the subtle shift in his posture. She knew Kael better than anyone. Every scar, every loss they had suffered together was etched into his skin, into the way he carried himself. And yet, this moment felt different, like the silence before a storm. The remnants of the world had always been a backdrop to their survival, a hostile environment that forced humans to adapt or perish. But Kael had always clung fiercely to his humanity, even when everything around them seemed determined to tear it away. His determination was part of what had drawn her to him, what had kept them moving forward all these years. But now, something had changed, something fundamental. She took a step closer, her boots making a faint sound against the metallic floor. Kael's head tilted slightly, acknowledging her presence without turning to face her. "It's happening, isn't it?" she asked softly, though she already knew the answer. Kael didn't reply at first, his gaze fixed on the pod in front of him. Inside, the faint outline of an embryo, suspended in stasis, seemed almost like a ghost, a memory of a species that no longer belonged to this world. "I can feel it," he finally said, his voice quiet but filled with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. "It's like something inside me is waking up, something that doesn't belong to me." Elara swallowed hard, her heart racing. She had known this day might come, had felt the undercurrent of change within Kael for weeks, maybe even months. The signs were there, the subtle shifts in his behavior, the way his body seemed to heal faster than it should, the way he moved with a fluidity that felt almost unnatural. But she hadn't wanted to believe it. She hadn't wanted to face the possibility that the man she loved could become something else, something other. Kael's fingers twitched against the pod's surface, and he drew in a slow, controlled breath. "I think it started when we crossed into the wastelands," he murmured. "When we encountered that creature, the one that shouldn't have let us go." Elara remembered that moment vividly. The creature had been massive, its scales shimmering with an iridescent glow as it stalked them through the ruins. They had been certain it would attack, there was no reason it wouldn't. Yet, instead of striking, it had paused, its alien eyes locking with Kael's before retreating into the shadows. At the time, they had chalked it up to luck, a rare moment of mercy in a world devoid of it. But now, Elara wondered if there had been something more. Something unspoken had passed between Kael and that creature, something that had changed him. "I'm not sure what it is," Kael continued, his voice growing more distant. "But it's getting stronger, and it's not just physical. It's in my mind, too. I can feel the connection, like the world around me is reaching out, pulling me toward it." Elara's stomach twisted as his words sank in. This wasn't just a question of survival anymore. This was something far deeper, something that struck at the core of what it meant to be human. Kael was changing, evolving into something that didn't belong to their world, and if he embraced that change, she wasn't sure there would be anything left of the man she loved. "You can't let it take you," Elara said, her voice trembling slightly. "You have to fight it. We've been through too much to lose ourselves now." Kael finally turned to face her, his eyes intense but filled with a sadness she hadn't seen in him before. "Maybe that's the problem," he said softly. "Maybe we've been fighting for so long that we've forgotten what we're fighting for." Elara's heart ached at his words. She could see the internal battle playing out within him, the conflict between the man he had been and the creature he was becoming. He had always been a fighter, always driven by the need to protect those he cared about. But now, that drive was being twisted, redirected towards something he couldn't control. "Kael," she whispered, stepping closer until she was just inches away from him. She reached out, her fingers brushing his arm, and for a moment, she felt the familiar warmth of his skin beneath her touch. But there was something else there, too, something that made her pull back instinctively. His skin was different, warmer, almost feverish, and it pulsed faintly beneath her fingertips. Kael noticed her reaction, and his expression darkened. "It's not just inside me anymore," he said, his voice tight. "It's starting to show." Elara's eyes flickered to his hand, where his fingers seemed to tremble slightly. The veins beneath his skin were more pronounced, dark and shifting, as if something was moving just beneath the surface. She bit her lip, trying to suppress the wave of fear that threatened to overwhelm her. "How long have you known?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kael hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "A few weeks, maybe longer, it's hard to tell." Elara's mind raced as she tried to make sense of it all. Kael had always been resilient, able to withstand injuries that would have killed others. But this wasn't just about survival. This was something else entirely. This was a transformation, one that threatened to pull him away from her and from everything they had fought to protect. "We can't let it happen," she said, her voice firm despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "There has to be a way to stop it." Kael shook his head slowly. "I don't think it can be stopped, Elara. It's part of me now. It's who I'm becoming." Elara clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms as she fought to keep her emotions in check. "But who are you becoming?" she demanded. "What does that even mean? Are you still going to be you, or is this, whatever this is, going to take over?" Kael's eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw the man she had fallen in love with, the man who had always stood by her side, no matter how dark the world had become. But there was something else in his gaze now, something deeper and more primal, something that scared her. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice filled with a raw honesty that cut through her like a blade. "I don't know what I'm going to become." Elara's chest tightened, and she felt tears sting the corners of her eyes. She had always prided herself on her strength, her ability to keep moving forward even when the world around them was falling apart. But this was different. This was something she couldn't fight, something she couldn't control. Kael reached out and gently took her hand, his grip surprisingly steady despite the turmoil she could see in his eyes. "I need you to understand something," he said quietly. "Whatever happens, whatever I become, I won't forget who I am. I won't forget who we are." Elara nodded, though her heart ached with uncertainty. She wanted to believe him, wanted to hold on to the hope that they could find a way through this. But deep down, she knew that things were changing. Kael was changing. And whether they liked it or not, their future was no longer just about survival. It was about evolution, about becoming something new in a world that had left humanity behind. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them filled with the weight of their unspoken fears. Then, slowly, Kael released her hand and turned back toward the rows of containment pods. "I think I need to see it," he said quietly. "I need to know what's happening to me." Elara frowned, unsure of what he meant. "See what?" Kael's gaze remained fixed on the pod in front of him. "The next step?" Without another word, he reached for the control panel beside the pod, his fingers moving with a strange certainty. The ancient machinery hummed to life, and the pod began to shift, its frost-covered surface sliding open to reveal the embryo inside. Elara's breath caught in her throat as she watched. The embryo, suspended in the pod's gel-like fluid, was small, delicate, barely more than a cluster of cells. But there was something about it that felt wrong. It was as if the life growing inside wasn't entirely human. Kael stared at it, his expression unreadable. "This is what they were trying to create," he said softly. "A new species, one that could survive in this world." Elara's stomach churned. "But it's not human," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's something else." Kael nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving the embryo. "Maybe that's the point. Maybe we're not supposed to stay the same. Maybe we're supposed to evolve, like everything else." Elara's mind raced as she tried to process his words. The implications were staggering. If Kael was right, if this transformation was part of some greater plan, then what did that mean for the future of humanity? "I don't know if I can accept that," she said quietly. "I don't know if I can watch you become something I don't recognize." Kael turned to face her, his expression softening. "I'm still me, Elara. No matter what happens, I'm still the person you love." Elara swallowed hard, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "But for how long?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kael didn't answer. He didn't need to. The quiet hum of the vault echoed through the vast underground chamber, a constant reminder of the ancient technology surrounding them. Kael stood at the edge of the room, staring at the massive control console that had remained dormant for centuries. The faint glow from the display screens illuminated his face, casting long shadows on the walls behind him. Elara watched from a distance, her heart heavy with the weight of what lay before them. They had come so far, but now the future of everything they knew rested on a single decision. The air inside the vault felt sterile, the scent of machinery and cold metal a stark contrast to the vibrant, untamed life that pulsed just beyond its reinforced doors. Elara could feel the weight of that life pressing in on them, the unseen presence of Earth's new reality. It was a living, breathing force, a chaotic energy that had shaped everything they had encountered since stepping beyond the remnants of humanity's civilization. Kael turned to her, his expression unreadable. "It's ready," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. He gestured to the console, the controls that would set into motion the technology meant to preserve humanity's future. The technology that could stop his transformation, and the transformation of anyone else who dared to follow the path that was being laid out before them. Elara stepped closer, her heart pounding in her chest. Her mind was a whirl of thoughts, of memories, of what had led them to this moment. She felt as though they stood on the edge of something vast and unknowable, like standing at the precipice of the universe itself. The decision they made now would ripple through the future, affecting not just themselves, but all of humanity. She looked at Kael, searching his eyes for the man she loved. But as she stared into his face, she saw something else, something deeper. His transformation was subtle, not yet fully realized, but there were signs. The veins on his arms pulsed with an almost imperceptible glow, and his eyes seemed darker, as though they held within them the secrets of the world outside. The world that had changed him. The world that was trying to claim him. "Are we sure this is the right thing?" she asked, her voice quiet but filled with the uncertainty she had carried with her since the beginning. "Is this really what we want?" Kael's gaze softened, and for a moment the tension between them seemed to dissolve. He walked toward her, his footsteps slow, deliberate. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice raw with emotion. "I don't know if there is a right choice." Elara lowered her eyes, her mind torn between conflicting emotions. On one hand, she understood the magnitude of what was at stake. Humanity's survival, its legacy, depended on the technology within the vault. It was a chance to preserve what they were, to cling to the past in the hope that it would guide them through the future. But on the other hand, Kael's evolution was a testament to the idea that change was inevitable, that the Earth had moved beyond humanity's grasp. It was no longer theirs to control. "What if this evolution isn't a threat?" Kael continued, his voice steady now, though still tinged with the uncertainty he struggled to hide. "What if it's a chance to become something more, something that can survive in the world we live in now?" Elara felt a knot form in her stomach as she listened to his words. He had always been the strong one, the one who believed in pushing forward no matter what obstacles lay in their path. But now, that strength had become something else, something she wasn't sure she could follow. He was changing, and she didn't know if she could change with him. "You're talking about letting go of everything we are," she said softly. "Everything we've fought for. Everything we've tried to preserve." Kael shook his head, a trace of frustration crossing his features. "Maybe that's the problem, Elara. Maybe we've been trying too hard to hold on to the past. We keep fighting for what was instead of accepting what is." She bit her lip, her mind racing. She understood his argument, but the idea of abandoning humanity's legacy, of letting it fade into the history of a world that no longer belonged to them, felt like a betrayal. How could they turn their backs on the millions who had come before them, the sacrifices that had been made to ensure their survival? And yet, how could they continue to fight for a place in a world that was no longer theirs? "Is this really who you want to become?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you want to lose yourself to this evolution?" Kael met her gaze, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and sorrow. "I'm not losing myself, Elara. I'm becoming who I need to be. Maybe who we all need to be." Her chest tightened as she listened to his words. There was a part of her that wanted to believe him, that wanted to trust in the idea that evolution was the way forward. But there was another part of her, the part that clung fiercely to her humanity, that couldn't let go. She loved Kael with every fiber of her being, but she couldn't deny the fear that had been gnawing at her since she had first noticed the changes in him. "What if it changes you?" she asked, her voice trembling with the weight of the question. "What if you're not the same person anymore?" Kael's expression softened, and he took a step closer to her, his hand reaching out to gently touch her cheek. "I'll still be me," he whispered. "I'll still love you. That won't change." Elara closed her eyes, leaning into his touch for a brief moment. She wanted to believe him, wanted to hold on to the hope that their love could survive whatever changes lay ahead. But deep down, she knew that this decision wasn't just about them. It was about something much larger, something that went beyond their love or their personal desires. She opened her eyes, pulling away from his touch. "What if we use the technology?" she asked, her voice firmer now, though still tinged with uncertainty. "What if we preserve humanity's legacy, stop this evolution from happening? Isn't that worth something?" Kael's jaw tightened, and for a moment he was silent. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but filled with conviction. "I'm not sure we can stop it, Elara. Even if we use the technology, even if we try to hold on to the past, the world has already changed. We can't go back to what we were. Not really." Elara felt a lump rise in her throat as his words sank in. He was right. The world outside the vault had evolved into something new, something dangerous and unfamiliar. Humanity's place in it was no longer secure. And yet, the idea of letting go, of allowing themselves to be swept up in that evolution, felt like an admission of defeat. "We've survived so much," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "We've fought to keep humanity alive, to preserve what's left of us. How can we just let that go?" Kael sighed, his shoulders sagging under the weight of the decision before them. "Maybe survival isn't about preserving what we were," he said softly. "Maybe it's about accepting what we can become." Elara's heart ached as she listened to his words. She could see the truth in them, but it didn't make the choice any easier. If they activated the ancient technology, they could preserve humanity's essence, keep it alive for future generations. But at what cost? Would they be condemning themselves to a future that no longer fit the world they lived in? Would they be denying the possibility of something greater? And then there was Kael. His transformation was already underway, the signs of it becoming more pronounced with each passing day. If they activated the technology, it could stop the process, keep him from evolving into whatever the Earth was trying to make him. But it would also mean sacrificing the chance for him to become something more, to embrace the changes that could potentially save them in this new world. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kael met her gaze, his eyes filled with the same uncertainty she felt. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I do know that whatever we choose, we have to do it together." Elara felt tears sting the corners of her eyes as his words sank in. Together, that had always been their way, from the moment they had first met in the ruins of their world. They had fought side by side, survived side by side, and now, as they stood on the edge of a decision that could change everything, they would face it together. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing thoughts. "What if we activate the technology," she said slowly, "but leave the choice open for others? What if we preserve humanity's legacy, but also give people the choice to evolve if they want to?" Kael frowned, considering her words. "You mean, let people decide for themselves whether to hold on to the past or embrace the future?" Elara nodded. "It doesn't have to be one or the other. We can give people the chance to choose." Kael's expression softened as he thought it over. "Maybe that's the answer," he said quietly. "Maybe the future isn't about one path or the other. Maybe it's about giving people the freedom to decide." Elara felt a small spark of hope ignite in her chest as she listened to his words. It wasn't a perfect solution. There were still so many unknowns, so many risks. But it felt right. It felt like the kind of choice that could honor both the past and the future, that could give humanity a chance to survive in whatever form it chose. She reached out, taking Kael's hand in hers. "We do this together," she said softly. "Whatever happens, we face it together." Kael squeezed her hand gently, his gaze steady and filled with the quiet strength that had always drawn her to him. "Together," he agreed. As they turned toward the console, ready to make their decision, Elara couldn't help but wonder what the future would hold. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with dangers and unknowns, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace. Whatever came next, they would face it side by side, with the knowledge that their choices, no matter how difficult, had been made together.